Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio.
Herzlich willkommen zur ersten virtuellen Sonderausgabe der Münchner Sicherheitskonferenz. Normalerweise würden sich hier in diesem Saal über 450 Staatsgäste aus aller Welt eng drängen. Der Saal ist im Moment gähnend leer. Pandemiebedingt kann die Münchner Sicherheitskonferenz im Moment noch nicht normal stattfinden. Die Betonung liegt auf noch. Switching now to English, as we have definitely, truly global audience joining us over live stream via the Munich Security Conference, various social media channels, Phoenix TV, BR24 and live television broadcasts around the world. My name is Natalie Amiri and I'm your Master of Ceremonies for today's unique event. We are proud and delighted to welcome you to this special Munich Security Conference, an important gathering with the world's most distinguished and senior decision makers. Speakers and presenters at this year's MSC include esteemed dignitaries such as German Chancellor Angela Merkel, French President Emmanuel Macron, the Secretary General of the United Nations Antonio Guterres, and for the first time ever, US President Joe Biden. There is, of course, so much to cover. The overarching focus of today's event will be beyond Westerness, renewing transatlantic cooperation, meeting global challenges. And I'm here with the chairman of the Munich Security Conference, Ambassador Wolfgang Ischinger. Good evening.
Hello, Natalie.
Before we continue, I wanted to show you something. Do you see my earring?
I surely do.
I got this especially for today. I wanted to remind you of the words you said 2 years ago on this very event. You said, you wore this EU hoodie, you said, I quote, "Europe must speak and act for itself with one voice." So it will be interesting to hear what you and all the other leaders who gathered for the next 3 hours will say about the state of the West and the state of Europe.
Great reminder of the role of Europe that we want to develop. Thank you, Natalie. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this very special edition of the Munich Security Conference. For almost 6 decades now, world leaders have met each winter here at Hotel Bayerischer Hof in the heart of Munich to discuss the most pressing challenges for global peace and international stability. Although we can't convene an in-person conference this year, we remain deeply committed to our core mission, namely to provide a global platform for informal critical dialogue. Dialogue on how to preserve peace, how to promote cooperation, and certainly how to prevent more conflict. Here in Germany, many thought that after the end of the Cold War, after the miracle of German reunification 30 years ago, that we were going to be blessed by everlasting peace and harmony, now being surrounded only by friends. When we look at Europe today, however, we find that Europe is surrounded by a ring of fire, by bloody conflicts in the east. Think of Ukraine, think of the Caucasian region, but also in the south, around the eastern Mediterranean, and in our African neighborhood. Great power competition has made a serious comeback. The rules-based international order and its institutional framework have been under attack. And we are, of course, faced with the massive impact of climate change and of the pandemic, with potentially crippling effects on global stability, on prosperity, and on human rights. A year ago, here in this hall, we discussed the notion of Westlessness, the sense that the world, but in particular the West itself, was getting less rules-based, less value-driven. The past year has, I'm sorry to say, confirmed our diagnosis. Many of the geopolitical certainties that have defined the post-Cold War era are continuing to be dangerously eroding. But today, let's focus also on the hopes going forward. Let's therefore look beyond Westlessness. How can we rebuild, renew, and reform the transatlantic partnership? And how can we join forces to tackle global challenges such as climate change and the current pandemic? How can we tackle these challenges together? It gives me enormous pleasure to welcome some of the world's most important and most senior decision makers to this special event today. For the first time ever, the President of the United States will address the Munich Security Conference. 2 years ago, standing in this very room, Joe Biden said, "We will be back." Thank you, Mr. President, for keeping your promise. And thank you for choosing Munich for your very first message addressed to your allies and partners in Europe. Let me also offer a very warm welcome to the other world leaders who will speak to us in the course of the next 2 or 2.5 hours, including President Macron, including Chancellor Merkel, including Prime Minister Boris Johnson, and the leaders of key global and European institutions. Finally, I would also like to offer a warm welcome to our Munich young leaders. We have invited this impressive cohort of young professionals to ask our guests some tough questions. Ladies and gentlemen, without Munich and without Bavaria, there is no Munich Security Conference. This is why it is now my privilege to invite the Minister President of the Free State of Bavaria, Markus Söder, to offer his welcoming remarks. Herr Ministerpräsident, ich freue mich, dass Sie hier heute dabei sind. Sie haben das Wort.
Mr. President, I'm delighted to have you here today. You have the floor.
Lieber Herr Ischinger, alle Gäste, auch Ihr Team, ein herzliches Dankeschön erstens für die Einladung, aber auch für die Möglichkeit dabei zu sein. Die Münchner Sicherheitskonferenz ist die Plattform, die internationale Plattform schlechthin, in der nicht nur Politik ausgetauscht wird, sondern in der neben diplomatischen Höflichkeiten auch immer wieder Klartext gesprochen hat. Und das macht es sozusagen auch zu einer Art Oase der Ehrlichkeit, der Begegnung des Miteinanders. Normalerweise ist es so, dass wir dann eng gedrängt im Raum sitzen. Es finden neben dem offiziellen Podium unzählige einzelne Gespräche statt. Das macht auch den Charme dieser Sicherheitskonferenz aus. Heute ist es ein bisschen schwieriger. Deswegen ist es zumindest gut, dass wir auf dieser Form uns treffen. Und nachdem fast jeder eine spezielle Chat-Funktion noch hat, kann es hier bilaterale Chatverläufe geben zwischen den einzelnen Staatslenkern und den Staatsfrauen und Staatsmännern. Was mich ja sehr freut, ist, dass es in München ist und dass gerade heute die transatlantische Gemeinschaft im Vordergrund steht. Und da ist Bayern ein perfekter Platz dafür. Nicht nur wie üblich die Münchner Sicherheitskonferenz, sondern Bayern speziell. Wir haben seit Jahrzehnten enge Verbindungen zu den Vereinigten Staaten von Amerika. Ich selbst bin aufgewachsen neben einem US-Hospital, also dem Hospital der Truppen, und habe als Kind schon enge Verbindungen gehabt. Wir haben miteinander hinten den Sport gemacht, hinter dem Hospital. Ich bin in die PX gegangen, habe was zu essen bekommen. Also ich bin seit meiner frühesten Jugend an eigentlich transatlantisch geprägt und positiv. Aber was immer verbunden hat in all den Jahrzehnten, war nicht nur einfach der Begriff Verbündete, sondern Partner. Und zwar Partner nicht nur mit gemeinsamen Interessen, sondern mit gemeinsamen Werten. Das war und ist das Fundament dieser Freundschaft. Das war und ist das Fundament der NATO. Die letzten Jahre, gebe ich zu, war das gar nicht so einfach. Denn man hat so den Eindruck gehabt, dass aus echten Freunden zumindest distanzierte Nachbarn geworden sind. Und manche stabile, feste Brücke hat schon einen kleinen Knacks bekommen, durch das Verhalten, durch manche Aussagen. Insofern ist uns allen daran gelegen, diese Freundschaft, diese Partnerschaft, diese Gemeinsamkeit zu erneuern. Und deswegen ist es so ein ermutigendes und positives Signal, dass der neue Präsident die erste Gelegenheit nutzt, mit und in Europa zu sprechen und das auch noch in München bei dieser Sicherheitskonferenz. Ein tolles Signal. Und warum ist diese Partnerschaft so wichtig? Nun, die Welt verändert sich. Wir haben internationale Herausforderungen wie Corona, Klimawandel, Sicherheit, die gehen uns alle an. Herausforderungen, die an keinen Grenzen Halt machen, sondern die jeden Einzelnen von uns treffen. Klar ist aber auch, es gibt unterschiedliche gesellschaftliche Modelle. Das, was uns verbindet in der transatlantischen Idee, ist doch die gemeinsame Idee von Menschenrechten, von Freiheit, von Demokratie, von Rechtsstaatlichkeit. Und deswegen denke ich, ist auch so wichtig, dass wir diese Ideen gemeinsam vertreten. Jeder mit seinen speziellen Interessen, aber doch gemeinschaftlich. Und vielleicht können wir mit dem heutigen Tag auch wieder Brücken erneuern oder sogar neue zusätzliche bauen in dieser schwierigen Zeit. Denn eines ist für mich jedenfalls klar: Weltoffenheit, Multilateralismus sind, glaube ich, die einzigen echten Chancen, all diese Herausforderungen zu meistern. Alles auf der Basis von Vernunft und auch von wissenschaftlichen Fakten. Denn wenn es eine Sprache der Internationalität gibt, dann doch die der Wissenschaft. Denn die Wissenschaft hält sich selten an Grenzen. Sie kooperieren überall in der Welt zusammen. Kooperation und Verständnis, Gemeinsamkeit und Freundschaft. Das könnte der Motto und das Thema auch für diese nächsten Stunden sein. Ich wünsche uns allen gute Gespräche und lade alle ein, dann, wenn es wieder geht, nach Bayern zu kommen. Sie wissen selbst, Deutschland ist wunderschön, aber Bayern ist ganz besonders schön. Und deinen Eindruck gewinnen Sie bei mir im Hintergrund. So sieht es derzeit bei uns aus. Das können Sie heute nicht erleben, aber Sie wissen und spüren, Sie sind bei uns immer willkommen, immer als Gäste und immer als Freunde. Alles Gute und viel Erfolg. Und Herr Ischinger, Ihnen und Ihrem Team nochmal Dankeschön für die tolle Organisation vorab.
Thank you, Minister President Söder. To kick off today's discussions, we will start by looking at challenges that we have on a global scale. What are the areas in which international cooperation is currently most urgently needed? With this question in mind, we cannot ignore our first speaker.
He stands for multilateralism like no other. Antonio Guterres. Already during his time as UN High Commissioner for Refugees, he was a frequent attendee in Munich. In 2017, he made his first appearance at the Security Conference as Secretary General of the United Nations.
We are kind of in a chaotic situation, probably leading to a multipolar world. But in these chaotic situations with unclear power relations, impunity and unpredictability have been the name of the game. And it is in this context that I believe that we need, and I've said it several times, a surge in diplomacy for peace.
4 years after this speech, these words are as relevant as ever.
I am delighted to welcome the Secretary General of the United Nations. Welcome, Antonio Guterres. This is already your 5th time to address the Munich Security Conference. We are witnessing today how decades of global progress are being threatened. The health crisis increases fragility and contributes to conflict. This is why we, at the Munich Security Conference, have called the COVID-19 crisis a polypandemic. We look forward to hearing from you, Mr. Secretary General, how we can tackle these challenges multilaterally. You have the floor. Please, Antonio.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be back in Munich, even if virtually. And dear friends, our global tests and challenges are getting bigger and more complex. Yet our responses remain fragmented and insufficient. COVID-19 has X-rayed the world, exposing deep fissures and fragilities. Those vulnerabilities go well beyond pandemics and public health. Climate catastrophe is looming, inequality and discrimination are ripping the social fabric, corruption is destroying trust, the struggle for women's rights faces a pushback, the Sustainable Development Goals are off track, Wild West behavior in cyberspace has created new vectors of instability, And even the nuclear disarmament regime is eroding despite the welcome recent decision of the United States and the Russian Federation to extend the New START treaty. Now, 2021 must be the year to get back on track. And pandemic recovery is our chance. 4 imperatives, in my opinion, stand out. First, a global vaccination plan. Vaccines must be available and affordable for everyone, everywhere. Vaccine equity is crucial for saving lives and for saving economies. Countries need to share excess doses and provide the billions needed for the COVAX initiative to be in full swing. And we also need at least a doubling of global manufacturing capacity through sharing of licenses and technology transfer. I believe the G20 is well placed to establish an emergency task force to prepare such a global vaccination plan, bringing together the countries, the companies, the international organizations, and the financial institutions that have the required power, scientific expertise, and production and financial capacities. And I'm ready to galvanize the full United Nations system in support of this effort, starting by the World Health Organization. Our second priority must be to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions by mid-century. And there is a reason for hope. Now countries representing more than 65% of emissions and more than 70% of the world economy have committed to net zero greenhouse emissions by 2050. Let's expand this coalition to 90% by the November climate conference in Glasgow. All countries, cities, corporations, and financial institutions should set benchmarks to implement the net zero transition in the next 30 years. And this should start now with concrete steps to put a price on carbon, to end subsidies and financing for coal and other fossil fuels, and to reinvest those funds in renewable energy and in just transition. Third, we need to ease geopolitical tensions and enhance the diplomacy for peace. We cannot solve the biggest problems when the biggest powers are at odds. Our world cannot afford a future where the 2 largest economies split the globe into 2 opposing areas in a great fracture, each with its own dominant currency and trade and financial rules, its own internet, and its own artificial intelligence capacity and strategy. A technological and economic divide risks turning into a geostrategic and military divide, and we must avoid this at all costs. I also want to repeat my call for a global ceasefire. We have seen some encouraging signs in a few stubborn peace processes, but elsewhere, fighting continues, and everyone is losing. And we also need a ceasefire beyond traditional battlefields, in homes, workplaces, schools, and public transportation, where women and girls face an epidemic of violence, and in cyberspace, where attacks of all kinds are happening every day. Digital technologies must be a force for good, and that requires also a total ban on lethal autonomous weapons, the most dangerous dimension that artificial intelligence can bring to the future of war. Fourth, it's time to redefine global governance for the 21st century. The collective security arrangements agreed on more than 75 years ago have prevented a Third World War. Our common principles must endure for the 21st century. And that means ensuring new ways to deliver global public goods, to build a fair globalization and solve common challenges. We do not need new bureaucracies, but we need to strengthen multilateralism so the world has a networked multilateralism that links global and regional organizations, economic and political entities, and an inclusive multilateralism that engages businesses, cities, universities, and movements for gender equality, climate action, and racial justice. And a multilateralism that respects the rights of future generations. Many believe that growing multipolarity in the world will guarantee by itself peace. But let us read history. More than a century ago, Europe was multipolar, but there was no multilateral governance mechanisms, and the result was the First World War. Now is the time for solidarity and international cooperation to tackle our even bigger and more complex challenges. And I'm convinced that if you are determined, we can achieve our shared goals, and I thank you.
Thank you very much, Secretary General. The first question that we have for you comes from our Munich young leaders, Lua Miao from China. Over to Beijing. Miao, you have the floor.
Your Excellency Secretary General Guterres, greetings from Beijing, China. My question is that currently, pandemic is the most urgent global challenge. Can the United Nations, including WHO, lead the global efforts of the EU, United States, China to convene the Trilateral Global Vaccine Summit to coordinate the vaccine production, distribution, and R&D standardization for the world, especially for the developing countries? Thank you.
Thank you, Miao. Mr. Secretary General, your answer, please.
Well, thank you very much for your question that really puts emphasis on the need of international cooperation. But I think we need more than what you said. I do believe we need to make sure that we bring together all those countries, but also companies that have power, scientific expertise, and industrial and logistics capacity in order to be able to produce and to implement a global vaccination plan to make sure that the vaccine reaches everybody everywhere. In my opinion, the entity that is best placed to gather those entities, countries, companies, international organizations, is today the G20. And the UN is ready to fully support that effort. But what is clear for me is the present situation remains chaotic. Of course, we see some good signals. We see now the US supporting COVAX. We see several countries announcing that they will share their excess vaccines. But 75% of the doses distributed until now were only in 10 countries, and more than 100 countries have not yet received any single dose. So the risk is, if we vaccinate only the developed countries and we let the virus spread in the developing world, the virus will mutate. Mutating will be more dangerous, but also more able to resist vaccines, and it might come back to haunt the developed world that has thought to protect their people, but then will not be able, with the vaccines of the past, to answer with the new variants of the virus. So we absolutely must mobilize the whole world to vaccinate everybody, everywhere, in the quickest possible way, and for that we need an emergency task force, and I think the G20 is probably the best place for that to be implemented.
Thank you, Secretary General. For our second question, we go to our Munich young leader, Yasmin El-Gamal from the United States.
Mr. Secretary, you recently wrote an op-ed with several world leaders talking about the importance of multilateralism. You also highlighted several global emergencies that we need to tackle together, including the global pandemic and the environment. And yet we find ourselves in a world today where some countries, including veto-wielding members of the UN Security Council, are challenging the very multilateralism that you speak of. So how does the UN tackle these challenges to the international order so that the emergencies that you highlighted can indeed be tackled together? Thank you.
Thank you, Yasmin. Mr. Secretary General.
My answer is an answer of hope. I think we are seeing multilateralism coming back in strength. It's not only the fact that the new administration has clearly re-established the engagement of the United States with but there are a number of other signals that are very important in the reaction of the global public opinion and of the global society. Look at, for instance, the COVID. The biggest enemy of multilateralism is, of course, nationalism and populism. But nationalist and populist leaders have basically failed in the way they led their countries against COVID. And this is being felt more and more by public opinions that understand that they need rational approaches to fight the vaccine and that they need international cooperation. And they are putting more and more pressure for that to happen. And we see that in the recent announcements that were made by several countries in order to join a collective effort. On the other hand, climate change. It's amazing. In the last few months, we have seen coming back to the multilateral approach that has recommended and has put as a target the net zero emissions for 2050. We have seen the European Union, the UK, but we have seen afterwards China, we have seen Japan, we have seen Korea, now we see the United States, and we see a huge dynamic in the preparation of the COP26 for Glasgow. Again, multilateralism, I feel it's coming back. Of course, we need to strengthen multilateral institutions. I sometimes say multilateral institutions have no teeth, and then when they have teeth, they show little appetite to bite, as you mentioned in relation to a divided Security Council. We need to have multilateral institutions with more strength, but also more inclusive. In the past, governments would be the only meaningful political entity. No longer the case. Power is much more distributed. If you want multilateral institutions to work, and it's true for the UN, we need to bring into them cities, we need to bring into them the private sector, the civil society, the business community in general. And we need to make sure that things that were in the past only regulated by governments now are subject to a multi-stakeholder approach that can, for instance, in the case of cyberspace, in the case of the internet, create conditions that allow those new technologies and those new trends to be a force for good. I truly believe we are seeing multilateralism coming back, and I truly believe it can be a strengthened and more inclusive multilateralism.
Mr. Secretary General, today's event has a specific transatlantic focus. The governments represented here today belong to the wealthiest, the most powerful. So if I may ask you this question, what is your specific expectation when you look at Washington, D.C., when you look at Brussels, when you look at London, Paris, or Berlin? What do we, the West, collectively and individually, need to contribute in order to make your program a success?
First, I think it's important the West to be united. The West was at odds with itself in the recent past. And I think, again, what is new in the Biden administration is a clear will to establish the transatlantic links. And second, I think the West needs to understand that the world is now much more multipolar. And the West needs to find a way to assert its values, namely the values of the Enlightenment, that have, of course, rationality, tolerance, but also human rights at its center. But asserting its values, the West needs to engage in a meaningful dialogue and cooperation with the other key actors in the global stage. And for instance, if one takes one crucial relationship, China and the West. Of course, in human rights, there will be inevitably a confrontation. But there is a convergence of interest in climate, and there is a need for a serious negotiation in relation to the aspects of trade and technology that either can be an area of cooperation or an area of very serious confrontation. So I think we need principle-minded but pragmatic approaches, and I think the West must be first united, but also, as I mentioned, able to assert its principles, but also able to engage in a multipolar world, strengthening multilateral institutions and finding the forms of possible cooperation to address the dramatic challenges that we face: COVID, climate, inequality, and others.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary General. Thank you very much, Antonio. I do hope that when we next meet again here in Munich physically, you will again speak from this podium and not only via satellite. Thanks again very much. And now back to Natalie.
Thank you, Wolfgang. What an insightful start into this afternoon's series. A subject which remains a top story all over the world and clearly shows the need for a joint international approach is the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. The topic of a global pandemic has been discussed on the Munich stage multiple times in recent years, including insights from two returning speakers who for a couple of years already have been warning us for the potential for and dangers of a deadly pandemic.
In hindsight, the warning that Bill Gates addressed to his audience at the Security Conference in 2017 appears almost prophetic. One thing was almost certain: a highly deadly global pandemic would occur during our lifetime. The founder of Microsoft, who has been actively engaged in the development of vaccines with his foundation for a long time, would soon be proven right.
1 year
1 year ago, it was already looming on the horizon. At the 2020 Security Conference, COVID-19 already played a role. The Chinese delegation reported an outbreak with more than 60,000 infected at the time. And WHO Director General Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus issued a warning. Even though there were only a few hundred known cases outside China, it would be impossible to predict how the pandemic would develop.
Here we are, 1 year later, and the world does look vastly different from what it looked in February 2010. And while vaccines now offer more than just a ray of hope, the pandemic is, of course, far from over. Clearly, the world should have listened more carefully in 2017. It is my enormous pleasure to welcome once again to the Munich Security Conference the co-chair of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Bill Gates himself. Bill, thank you for joining us again, for joining us today. And let me start with a straightforward question. What, in your view, must be done to ensure that the world will emerge stronger from the COVID-19 crisis? And how can the equitable distribution of COVID-19 vaccines be ensured globally? The Secretary General of the UN just referred to that issue, and we'd be extremely interested in have your views. Welcome again, Bill Gates.
Yeah, great to talk to you. It is a tragedy that the modest steps that would have been required to contain this epidemic weren't taken in advance. And so, given the trillions of dollars of damage and the other deficits that are tough to measure, we should make the investment, the small number of billions that we need to ensure ourselves that this never happens again. The good news is that in making those investments, we can create platforms and capacities that will help us immensely against current infectious disease. So if we have a team of 3,000 global experts, they can be working on things like measles and malaria and then move over to work on a pandemic. Likewise, in the tools area, we can create mRNA vaccine factories that have a lot of capacity globally, and those factories can be used for standard vaccines when there's not a pandemic. I want to say we can have very ambitious goals. A coronavirus universal vaccine, likewise a universal flu vaccine, the ability to make drugs that block transmission, and a diagnostic approach that can get 20% of the population per week actually at very low cost. So the tools, the R&D side needs to be funded, and the field capacity, the factories, the surveillance, that team of 3,000. But these investments will have fantastic returns even when there's not a pandemic. And I have very little doubt that given what a tragedy this has been, this time around, over the next 5 years, we'll get those things in place. You also asked about the vaccine equity. The creation of these vaccines is really a triumph. Both vaccine technologies that were initially pioneered for HIV, the mRNA that our foundation and others have been investing in for over a decade, they've come through, and a high percentage of them have been successful, but the inequity is still quite dramatic. Part of the way to solve that inequity is to get factories in India up in full speed. That's already happening with AstraZeneca. It'll happen with 2 of the others, and to get the financing. And there, we have to be thankful to Germany, who's led the calls for this COVAX. The U.S. came in just a couple months ago in a significant way. Japan, Canada, in fact, the entire G7 in the days ahead will have made generous pledges. So the finance piece will be there. As the rich countries get to high levels of vaccination, their factories can contribute. And so if we do this well, we'll have about a 6 to 8 month delta of the vaccination levels of the rich to the developing countries. Still longer than we'd like, but I have to say the cooperation of the pharmaceutical companies, the speed with which they innovated, the way that governments are now donating, and how we're using Gavi, which is so successful, to pull us all together means that we have a chance to get that gap to be only 6 months.
Thank you very much, Bill. Here comes the first question. It comes from one of our Munich young leaders, from Alexander Gabuev from Russia. Alexander.
Mr. Gates, given lack of cooperation between governments of great powers in fighting the pandemic, is there a way for corporate players and large charity organizations to step in and contribute in coordinated fashion regardless of country of origin or main jurisdictions? What would be the practical ways to enable such cooperation? Thank you.
Over to you, Bill.
Well, we certainly need governments. You know, when you have an emergency like this, you don't want to use just market signals, so that the richest citizens or countries get all the capacity. I have to say the companies, are mostly doing this on a non-profit basis, but the governments helped make, other than the case of Pfizer, who funded its own effort, the governments help provide the resources. The U.S. government, that's the one part of the epidemic the U.S. gets a high grade, is that the large BARDA grants got this work going full speed. The only other big funder was CEPI, which had been put in place post-Ebola, supported by UK, Norway, Japan, the Wellcome Trust Foundation, and our foundation. So the private sector's got the capacity, and that tie-up between Pfizer and BioNTech is a great example of transatlantic cooperation. In fact, I think the governmental role here, putting in place that pandemic preparedness, can be a shining example of renewed transatlantic cooperation, where we look at the different pieces, both the R&D and the field capacities, and work together on that. The fact that philanthropies, have come in and written checks very quickly, that our foundation knows the Indian manufacturers who we've helped get up to large capabilities, that was very helpful here. It saved at least 6 months to fund those factories early. But in general, you shouldn't rely on that. When it comes to the delivery piece, the nonprofit organizations are stepping up, particularly in communities where the trust of the vaccine is a challenge. Getting them to go in and encourage people and provide easy access, I think that's going to be, even for the next year, very, very important.
And here comes the next question from another Munich young leader. This one comes from India, Ambika Vishwanath. Ambika, where's your question?
Mr. Gates, given the importance of water in dealing with health security, how do you propose that non-profits and civil society organizations work with governments and multilateral agencies to ensure the somewhat parallel conversations of growing global water insecurity on the one hand and human health on the other come together to ensure that plans and processes going forward are more nuanced, interconnected, and collaborative in nature? Thank you.
Bill, please.
Well, we certainly have areas of incredible water shortage today, particularly for agriculture. And sadly, because of climate change, that stress is going to get even worse. That is, you'll have droughts more often and also floods more often. And so we have adaptation where we need to create a new generations of seeds that are more drought tolerant, more flood tolerant, more temperature tolerant. That's a grossly underinvested area that has the highest payback in terms of helping with climate adaptation. Also with water, we have the rapid urbanization, but it's often done without the right sanitation or water supply into the fast-growing parts of those cities. And so we need to rethink sanitation. Often there's no plan at all. That's disastrous in terms of quality of living and disease. And so new tools so that the cost of doing high-quality sanitation gets to be a bit lower, and we do it so it doesn't itself become a great user of water. That's really required because we're going to be so urbanized. So both cities and farms, a lot to be done in the face of climate change for water.
Thank you, Bill. Let's try to connect the dots between the lessons from the pandemic and the issue of climate change. So now that we've been through 1 year of COVID-19, what can we learn, in your view, Bill, from the global response to the pandemic as we tackle the global issue of climate change? Please.
Yeah, I think, when we think of security, which this great conference is focused on, we need to think of security broadly. So the narrow view would be, okay, it's just about, armies and war games and avoiding nuclear war. And of course that is ultra important. I won't play that down at all. But the broader view is that governments working collaboratively should prevent tragedies like the pandemic and like climate change. For the pandemic, the right experts weren't pulled in, the right resources weren't put together, and so we basically failed our citizens by making those wise investments. In the case of the pandemic, the good news is that a single miraculous tool, the vaccine, once we make billions of them for the entire world, will largely end this crisis. And so that, it's fantastic, and we can start to rebuild. With climate change, it's not like that. You can't wait until it's a problem, because the natural ecosystems that are collapsing and the destroying the ability to do farming anywhere near the equator, even going out during the summer, humans can't withstand that type of high temperature, high humidity environment. And so the amount of migration will make what happened after the Syrian civil war look very, very small. And so climate is a gigantic security issue, but not in the near term. Yes, we have heat waves, forest fires, coral die-off. We have farmers near the equator already experiencing malnutrition, and it's driving some migration. But it gets worse every year. So in 20 years it's bad. By the end of the century, it's very dramatic. But to avoid that, we have to do things that have a long lead time, like take our manufacturing base and change the way we make steel and cement. The awareness of all these sources is pretty narrow right now. It's very focused on the easy parts, the passenger cars and the electricity generation, which represent less than a third of the problem. And so the two issues are very similar in that governments, in a collaborative way, need to come up with a solution. But climate change will kill 5 times as many people per year as the peak of the pandemic by the end of the century, and it will be accelerating, and without a simple tool to stop that right away.
I think we have time for one last question. Boris Johnson hosted a meeting of the G7 leaders, which has just ended, as I understand, and he will join us later in this program. So my question to you is, concerning the fight against the pandemic, what do you expect from the G7 group of countries? what kinds of concrete steps and decisions would you want to come out of the G7 summit in the early summer?
Well, I think by then, with the great contributions we've seen, we should have this facility to buy the vaccines for the developing countries through Gavi. We should have that fully funded, and we should be able to achieve a fairly high coverage level in those developing countries. And so I'm really gratified that the European Union, the G7 countries really have made that a priority. The U.S. was late to come in. Only last December did they show up and make their commitment. But now that that's in place, other countries are even increasing what they're doing, including Germany. So that, I think, is in good shape. The second thing is that despite all the push and shove about vaccine allocation, we need to keep the trade going because all the components of these vaccines are very international, and we need to make sure that these second source factories, that the right regulatory speed but also quality is applied there. Right now we're coming up with a strategy to deal with the variants. We're very lucky that studies that our foundation had funded in South Africa were looking at 3 of the vaccines during the period that a variant came in. And so that gave us the data about which vaccines work well against the variant. Fortunately, 2 of them work very well against even what so far has been the worst variant, but we are going to tune the vaccine so that efficacy goes up even more. Making sure that the supply is there, the financing is there, and participating with Gavi and driving that demand. We will have a question of, do we let this disease remain endemic or do we go for an eradication? And over the course of this year, we'll gather the data to see what's possible there. I do think eventually a universal coronavirus vaccine can be done, and I'd love to see that summit state some very high ambition goals about dealing with this respiratory virus threat in a dramatic way, which would have huge benefits in normal years. If you can get rid of flu, if you can have a team that helps accelerate getting rid of measles and malaria, global health now really is global. It's not just the developing countries. We've been reminded that we're all at risk, and what are actually fairly modest, billions of dollars investments are what can prevent a tens of trillions of dollars event from taking place. And so, sadly, there's no value to saying I told you so. The value is in having a very ambitious R&D and field capacity agenda that can help with other health issues and make sure this never happens again.
Thank you very much, Bill. My team and I, we do look forward to continuing our great cooperation with you personally and with the wonderful people at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation who've been so helpful to us over the years. So thank you very much. 1 year ago, ladies and gentlemen, our next guest stood on this very stage and shared his concern about COVID-19 and urged the world to act. WHO has played, of course, a central role in the fight against the pandemic. On the other hand, the organization has been in the midst of serious political disputes and challenges. I now have the pleasure to welcome the Director General of WHO, Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus. Welcome, Tedros. Hello to Geneva. A year ago, as you...
Hello to you too. Vielen Dank for having me here.
Thank you. A year ago, as you arrived at the Munich Security Conference after flying overnight from Congo, where WHO was leading a response to the Ebola outbreak, In your speech then, you asked us to come together to fight a common, dangerous enemy. Looking back today, a year later, are we succeeding or are we failing? Please.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Ishinga again, and very nice to see you virtually. It's always a privilege to speak at the Munich Security Conference. And as you rightly said, when I spoke at the Munich Security Conference a year ago, I said that COVID-19 is dangerous, very dangerous, and public enemy number one. And I remember at the time, people were a bit actually concerned, and some followed me and said, Tedros, when you say it's very dangerous and public enemy number one, they said, are you not exaggerating? Unfortunately, in the past year, we have all learned some painful lessons, and we have seen how very dangerous this virus is. Although the COVID-19 pandemic is a global health crisis, as you know, it's an uneven pandemic. Not all countries have responded in the same way, and not all countries have been affected in the same way. Many countries have succeeded in preventing or controlling widespread transmission with proven public health measures, testing, contact tracing, quarantine, physical distancing, hand hygiene, masks, and so on, as you know. In combination with those proven public health measures, vaccines are now giving us real hope of controlling the pandemic. But to realize the full power of vaccines, we need three things. First, we need governments to fully fund COVAX and to donate doses now. We're grateful for the announcements made today by several G7 countries. Second, because COVAX buys vaccines that have WHO emergency use listing, we need manufacturers to share their full dossiers with WHO at the same time as they submit to the other regulators. And third, we need individuals to use their voices to advocate for vaccine equity. When people speak with one voice, governments listen. Vaccine equity is not just the right thing to do, it's also the smart thing to do. The longer it takes to suppress the virus everywhere, the more opportunity it has to change in ways that could make vaccines less effective and opportunity to mutate. We could end up back at square one. More vaccines are being developed, approved, and produced. There will be enough for everyone. But for now, vaccines are a limited resource. We must use them as effectively as we can. So, to come back to your question, are we succeeding? Yes. Cases and deaths are declining. We have a toolbox of proven public health measures. We now have powerful new tools that we could only dream about a year ago. But we must make sure we use those tools effectively, which means using them in all countries to protect the most at-risk groups. That's the best way to save lives and end the pandemic, restore confidence, and reboot the global economy. But we're making progress.
Dr. Tedros, we have a question from our Munich young leader, Joshua Walker, from the United States for you.
Mr. Director General, it's no secret that the WHO has become a domestic political topic here in the United States. My question to you is, looking towards the future, how can we make sure that the world, and specifically the Transatlantic Alliance in particular, is better aligned to face this type of challenge again?
Thank you, Joshua. What do you think, Dr. Tedros?
Yeah, thank you so much. That's a very important question. As you know, the most important thing in order to fight pandemics like this is to believe in solidarity. And solidarity, of course, starts from national unity also, meaning at national level, anyone with different beliefs, maybe people across ideologies, across religious beliefs, and other differences should work together to fight an enemy like this, or a pandemic like this. So if you remember, the first thing we were calling for at the start of the pandemic was national unity. And by the way, I had the opportunity to speak to both aisles, not only in the US but other countries. And one thing we told them was, please, you can have political differences, and you can use other things to advance those political, to continue competing based on your political ideology. But please don't politicize this virus. This virus should actually unite you. And I know some countries have listened, and they had even a committee, a joint committee of political parties to plan together and to execute their plan together. So national unity is central, as you said. And that becomes the basis also for global solidarity. Without global solidarity, this virus cannot be defeated. It's a common enemy, and it spreads when we don't cooperate, and when we look inwards instead of looking outwards and trying to help each other. The world we're living in is a global community now, a small village, and the only option we have is solidarity and cooperation. So be it across the Atlantic or globally, in a world which is intertwined, interconnected, so close to each other, which is acting as a small village, the only option is cooperation and solidarity. That's where we should start. Then, of course, in that relationship, be it across Atlantic or other parts of the world should understand that health now is central. When health fails, when pandemic like this rages, when we become the hostage of a virus, you can see its impact. Economic impact and political impact, and you name it. It affects everything. And the whole world is now taken hostage by a small virus. So that shows health is central. And what we have been advocating for, universal health coverage and health for all, I think has to be taken seriously. Whether it's G7, G20, G30, G77, the whole world has to take it seriously. And of course, when we say health should be taken central, one very important issue is investment in public health is key. When the pandemic started, many countries, including high-income countries, were surprised because they haven't invested in public health. They haven't invested in primary health care. And the virus took advantage because there was no public health to counter. Of course, many countries have invested in medicine, specialty, subspecialty. But does that help to fight a virus like this? No. The most important part of the health system that fights pandemics is public health and primary health care. And that was a failure even in the most advanced economies in our world. So investment in public health, a consensus on that is very important. And then third, I will have a fourth one, but third, I think it's very important to see health in relation to the others also as one health. humans, animals, and the planet. You have the interaction every single day. And strengthening the One Health approach globally will be very important. That can help us to have a robust early warning system also. And among others, I would like also to consider the manufacturing industry. We should really strengthen the capacity of that, not only in the advanced economies, but globally, both in the north and south. You have seen the trade barriers at the start of the pandemic when countries couldn't get even PPEs. And some countries were even banning exports. It's because there was not enough production. So how can the world prepare in terms of production capacity too? Like what you said about Bill Gates, who predicted the pandemic. We know pandemics can happen. It's a matter of when, not if. So how can we increase our production capacity? Will be very important. Then the last one, I think across Atlantic or in the rest of the world, especially G7 are meeting. I think they have to sponsor the pandemic treaty. We can have many of these things I have said in that. We need a new treaty if we're serious enough about pandemics. And that will really help and prepare the world for the future. But the key is working together, considering the world as a small village, very much interconnected, and looking inwards wouldn't help, and we should cooperate. And we have learned this lesson the hardest way, by the way, and it's a must to cooperate, and it's a must to take attention, to give attention to solidarity. Thank you again for this question. It's very, very important, and I hope our young will take this seriously and bring the world together. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tedros. But wait, we have a second question for you from a Munich young leader. Her name is Shafak Pavay from Turkey.
As countries around the world are ramping up their efforts to roll out the vaccination, mistrust and conspiracy theories are also prevalent. We see segments of societies opposing the vaccination and also misinformation campaigns led by the voices that are against multilateralism, anti-science and anti-establishment. What are the efforts led by WHO and its partners to combat misinformation and confront these challenges?
Thank you, Shafak. Dr. Tedros?
Tashakur, that's also a very important question. And my friend, Ambassador Shinge, if you remember, one of the issues I raised then was about how infodemic is as dangerous as the pandemic itself. And we have been trying our best since then. But when we talk about infodemics, we should start from understanding the concerns or the questions that citizens raise. I think there are genuine concerns and questions that really start from anyone, anywhere, and we have to listen to those and try to have a mechanism that addresses these questions or concerns, because the misinformation in infodemic actually comes in response to some of the societal concerns and questions. So that's very, very important. And to address that, from the beginning we advise countries, the central role they have, especially authorities, to be open with their society and tell exactly what's happening and have a regular press conferences, sharing information and helping their citizens with any information they need and guiding them on what to do. So that's the basis, what countries do at national level. But in addition to that, as you know, globally, we have been holding pressers twice and 3 times a week from WHO, and we were communicating through other means too. But in addition to that, we have cooperated with tech industries, Facebook, Twitter, Tencent, Microsoft, you name them. And all these tech industries actually supported us. They have invested a lot to counter misinformation and disinformation. But I think doing more research will be important, and that's why we have now an advisory group on behavioral science to see from the citizen side, but at the same time to see from the media, like the social media side, on how to tackle infodemics in the future. You know, for many it's very clear that, for instance, take vaccines. Vaccines actually helped the world to reduce child mortality significantly, and vaccines work. And there are anti-vaxxers who can counter this, although the evidence we see is contrary to their claim. And that's why we need to make sure that all we do should be able to address the misinformation that's happening. And we believe vaccines work, and we know that, but we cannot take it for granted, because those who can control the media, especially the social media, can build their own narrative and, of course, influence the perception of the community. So that's why, in addition to what we do from the local level and national and sub-regional level, we're cooperating with the tech industry to use the social media to reach every corner. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tedros. I think we have time for one brief last question. And as you probably know, the next speaker in this program will be the President of the United States. So as the United States, as the Biden administration has decided to return to WHO, let us have your message to Joe Biden.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ambassador Ishinge. My message is to thank him. Even during the campaign, he said, I will reverse the decision the first day, and he honored his pledge. And I received his letter signed on January 20, actually, or the early morning of January 21st. Not only that, his Vice President Kamala Harris, called me, and we spoke about how to strengthen WHO and US cooperation. And third, we were in the middle of a board meeting, and Dr. Tony Fauci joined and also officially introduced the reversal of the previous decision, the withdrawal, and also the areas of cooperation. He outlined the areas of cooperation between WHO and the United States. So the message to President Biden is to express my sincere thanks. In addition to that, I think the US is very, very important, and it's not for the money. It's not the funding. US is the major funder of WHO, and I said it during the unnecessary misunderstanding then. It's not the money. It's the global leadership of the US. Its global role is key, which is actually very significant. We know the U.S. role, not only financing, but in leading the effort to fight the HIV pandemic, and how through the PEPFAR actually reversed the pandemic. Not only that, even if we go before then, the U.S. role, even during the Cold War, partnering with the former USSR to eradicate smallpox. And we're asking the same thing. Even when there are political problems between countries, I think countries can cooperate for a common purpose, like fighting a pandemic or a virus. And that's what President Biden is pledging for, and I really appreciate him for that and look forward to working with him. But since he started office, all they have done is very, very encouraging, and look forward to strengthening our partnership even higher. And I wish him all the very best.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. I want to conclude our discussion with you by saying that we do look forward, my team and I, to continue devoting important parts of our future agenda to issues of global health and to human security, and to working with you personally and with your wonderful team at WHO. Thank you again, Dr. Tedros, for your participation today. Thank you very much. And now back to Natalie.
Thank you, Wolfgang. Now we're coming to a highlight of this event, and to the topic that has been at the core of the Munich Security Conference since its inception, the transatlantic partnership. For decades, the Munich Security Conference has been bringing leaders from both sides of the Atlantic together to discuss the current state of international affairs as well as the transatlantic relationship, in good times and in more challenging ones. With the new US administration in place, the time is right to revive this transatlantic partnership. How to revive, we will see at the heart of the following session that could not have been more distinguished speakers.
Joe Biden and the Security Conference have a long-standing connection. Since his first visit as a young senator, he's returned to Munich time and again. For example, in 2009, when he just assumed what would become the second highest office of his career.
Das war für mich natürlich eine tolle Nachricht. Niemals zuvor hatten wir einen amtierenden amerikanischen Vizepräsidenten bei der Münchner Sicherheitskonferenz.
During his visits as Vice President, Joe Biden presented himself as a staunch transatlanticist.
Europe, all of you, are the cornerstone of the United States engagement in the rest of the world.
At Hotel Bayerischer Hof, Joe Biden also met with the German Chancellor. Just like him, Angela Merkel has been a frequent guest at the Security Conference ever since her time as opposition leader in the German Bundestag. For many observers, her remarks at the conference 2 years ago rank among her most passionate speeches.
Weil wir merken, wie der Druck groß ist auf unsere klassische, für uns gewohnte Ordnung. Ist jetzt die Frage, fallen wir in lauter Puzzlesteine auseinander und denken, jeder kann für sich alleine das Problem am allerbesten lösen? Und da kann man als deutsche Bundeskanzlerin nur sagen, da sind die Chancen für uns schlecht.
French President Emmanuel Macron made it clear at last year's Security Conference, in a world where the Americans are on the retreat, he's counting on a strong Europe.
Wir brauchen Handlungsfreiheit, Unabhängigkeit in Europa, eine eigene Strategie.
But already in 2019, Joe Biden gave a promise to the United States allies for the time after Donald Trump.
We will be back. Don't have any doubt about that.
He promised that one day the United States would do more for Europe and for NATO again.
Number one threat for the first time.
Ladies and gentlemen, making the transatlantic partnership work means reinvigorating ties among key countries in Europe and in North America. I could not be more excited today to welcome 3 very special guests, virtually, of course, to Munich today. Thank you so much for joining us. A very, very warm welcome. Good morning to Washington, D.C. Hallo nach Berlin. Et bonjour à Paris. Mr. President, Monsieur le Président, Frau Bundeskanzlerin, we are so excited to have you here together and have you talk about a new transatlantic agenda. And I'm sure you are aware that Boris Johnson will join this program a little later. He was still busy with wrapping up the G7 meeting in which you all participated earlier. So now, as our first speaker in this program, it is my privilege to welcome the 46th President of the United States. President Joe Biden has truly been a loyal and long-term friend of the Munich Security Conference. In 2019, Mr. President, you said in this very place, in this very hall, we will be back. Mr. President, thank you for keeping that promise. We welcome you back to the stage, and you have the floor. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. It's great to be with Angela and Emmanuel. We just spent a part of, from Washington perspective, morning together. But I want to say hello to everyone and thanks you at the Munich conference for hosting this special session. For decades, as you pointed out, I participated in the Munich Security Conference as a U.S. Senator, joining my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to affirm the importance of the transatlantic partnership. 3 times as Vice President of the United States, including delivering the first international foreign policy address of the Obama-Biden administration in the first months we were in office. And 2 years ago, as you pointed out, when I last spoke in Munich, I was a private citizen. I was a professor, not an elected official. But I said at that time, we will be back. And I'm a man of my word. America is back. I speak today as President of the United States at the very start of my administration, and I'm sending a clear message to the world. America is back. The transatlantic alliance is back. And we are not looking backward. We are looking forward together. It comes down to this. The transatlantic alliance is a strong foundation, the strong foundation on which our collective security and our shared prosperity are built. The partnership between Europe and the United States, in my view, is and must remain the cornerstone of all that we hope to accomplish in the 21st century, just as we did in the 20th century. The challenges we face today are different. We're at an inflection point. When I spoke to you as a senator and even as vice president, the global dynamics have shifted. New crises demand our attention. We cannot focus only on the competition among countries that threaten to divide the world, or only on global challenges that threaten to sink us all together if we fail to cooperate. We must do both, working in lockstep with our allies and partners. So let me erase any lingering doubt. The United States will work closely with our European Union partners and the capitals across the continent, from Rome to Riga, to meet the range of shared challenges we face. We continue to support the goal of a Europe whole and free and at peace. The United States is fully committed to our NATO alliance, and I welcome Europe's growing investment in the military capabilities that enable our shared defense. You know, to me and to the United States and to us, we'll keep faith with Article 5. It's a guarantee. An attack on one is an attack on all. That is our unshakable vow. And the only time Article 5 has been invoked was after the United States was attacked on 9/11. You, our allies, joined us to fight al-Qaeda, and the United States committed to consulting closely with our NATO allies and partners on the way forward in Afghanistan. My administration strongly supports the diplomatic process that's underway and to bring an end to this war that is closing out 20 years. We remain committed to ensuring that Afghanistan never again provides a base for terrorist attacks against the United States and our partners and our interests. Our European partners have also stood with us to counter ISIS. Just this week, NATO defense ministers endorsed significant expanded training and advisory mission in Iraq, which will be vital to the ongoing fight against ISIS. We cannot allow ISIS to reopen and regroup and threaten people in the Middle East and Europe and the United States and elsewhere. And while the United States is undergoing a thorough review of our own force posture around the world, I've ordered the halting and withdrawal of American troops from Germany. I'm also lifting the cap imposed by the previous administration on the number of U.S. forces able to be based in Germany. I know the past few years have strained and tested our transatlantic relationship, but the United States is determined to re-engage with Europe, to consult with you, to earn back our position of trusted leadership. Earlier today, as was referenced, I participated in the first meeting of the G7 leaders, where I spoke about the dire need to coordinate multilateral action to address COVID-19, the global economic crisis, and the accelerating climate crisis, and so much else. Achieving these goals is going to depend on a core strategic proposition, and that is the United States must renew America's enduring advantages so that we can meet today's challenges from a position of strength. That means building back better our economic foundations, reclaiming our place in international institutions, lifting up our values at home, and speaking out to defend them around the world. Modernizing our military capabilities while leading with diplomacy. Revitalizing America's network of alliances and partnerships that have made the world safer for all people. You know, I hope our fellow democracies are going to join us in this vital work. Our partnerships have endured and grown through the years because they are rooted in the richness of our shared democratic values. They're not transactional. They're not extractive. They're built on a vision of a future where every voice matters, where the rights of all are protected and the rule of law is upheld. None of this has fully succeeded in this, none of us has fully succeeded in this division. We continue to work toward it. And in so many places, including in Europe and the United States, democratic progress is under assault. I've known many of you for a long, long time, and you know that I speak my mind. So let me be very straightforward with you all. We are in the midst of a fundamental debate about the future and direction of our world. We're at an inflection point between those who argue that given all the challenges we face, from the fourth industrial revolution to the global pandemic, that autocracy is the best way forward, they argue. And those who understand that democracy is essential to meeting these challenges. Historians are going to examine and write about this moment as an inflection point, as I said. And I believe that every ounce of my being that democracy will and must prevail. We must demonstrate that democracy can still deliver for our people in this changed world. That, in my view, is our galvanizing mission. Democracy doesn't happen by accident. We have to defend it, fight for it, strengthen it, renew it. We have to prove that our model isn't a relic of history. It's the single best way to revitalize the promise of our future. And if we work together with our democratic partners with strength and confidence, I know we'll meet every challenge and outpace every challenger. You know, we must prepare together for long-term strategic competition with China. How the United States, Europe, and Asia work together to secure the peace and defend our shared values and advance our prosperity across the Pacific will be among the most consequential efforts we undertake. Competition with China is going to be stiff. That's what I expect, and that's what I welcome, because I believe in the global system Europe and the United States together with our allies in the Indo-Pacific worked so hard to build over the last 70 years. We can own the race for the future. But to do so, we have to be clear-eyed about the historic investments and partnerships that this will require. We have to protect for space for innovation, for intellectual property, and the creative genius that thrives with the free exchange of ideas in open democratic societies. We have to ensure that the benefits of growth are shared broadly and equitably, not just by a few. We have to push back against the Chinese government's economic abuses and coercion that undercut the foundations of the international economic system. Everyone must play by the same rules. U.S. and European companies are required to publicly disclose corporate governance structures and abide by rules to deter corruption and monopolistic practices. Chinese companies should be held to the same standard. We must shape the rules that will govern the advance of technology and the norms of behavior in cyberspace, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, so that they are used to lift people up, not used to pin them down. We must stand up for the democratic values that make it possible for us to accomplish any of this, pushing back against those who would monopolize and normalize repression. You know, this is also how we're going to be able to meet the threat from Russia. The Kremlin attacks our democracies and weaponizes corruption to try to undermine our system of governance. Russian leaders want people to think that our system is more corrupt or as corrupt as theirs. But the world knows that isn't true, including Russia's own citizens. Putin seeks to weaken the European project and our NATO alliance. He wants to undermine the transatlantic unity and our resolve, because it's so much easier for the Kremlin to bully and threaten individual states than it is to negotiate with a strong and closely united transatlantic community. That's why standing up for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine remains a vital concern for Europe and the United States. That's why addressing Russian recklessness and hacking into computer networks in the United States and across Europe and the world has become critical to protecting our collective security. The challenges with Russia may be different than the ones with China, but they're just as real. It is not about pitting East against West. It's not about we want a conflict. We want a future where all nations are able to freely determine their own path without a threat of violence or coercion. We cannot and must not return to the reflective opposition and rigid blocks of the Cold War. Competition must not lock out cooperation on issues that affect us all. For example, we must cooperate if we're going to defeat COVID-19 everywhere. My first presidential national security memorandum focused on surging health and humanitarian responses to defeat COVID-19 and to better prevent and prepare for the next pandemic. Today, I'm announcing that the United States is making a $2 billion pledge to COVAX with the promise of an additional $2 billion to urge others to step up as well. Yet even as we fight to get out of the teeth of this pandemic, the resurgence of Ebola in Africa is a stark reminder that we must simultaneously work to finally finance health security, strengthen global health systems, and create early warning systems to prevent, detect, and respond to future biological threats, because they will keep coming. We have to work together to strengthen and reform the World Health Organization. We need a UN system focused on biological threats that can move quickly to trigger action. Similarly, we can no longer delay or do the bare minimum to address climate change. This is a global existential crisis, and we'll all suffer the consequences if we fail. We have to rapidly accelerate our commitments to aggressively curb our emissions and to hold one another accountable for meeting our goals and increasing our ambitions. That's why, as President, I immediately rejoined the Paris Agreement. And as of today, the United States is officially, once again, a party to the Paris Agreement, which we helped put together. On Earth Day, I will host a Leaders Summit to help drive more ambitious actions among the top emitters, including domestic climate action here in the United States. I am grateful. I'm grateful for Europe's continued leadership on climate issues over the last 4 years. Together, we need to invest in the technological innovations that are going to power our clean energy futures and enable us to build clean energy solutions to global markets. The threat of nuclear proliferation also continues to require careful diplomacy and cooperation among us. We need transparency and communication to minimize the risk of strategic misunderstanding or mistakes. That's why the United States and Russia, notwithstanding other competition, extended the New START Treaty for an additional 4 years once I was sworn in. That's why we said we're prepared to re-engage in negotiations with the P5+1 on Iran's nuclear program. We must also address Iran's destabilizing activities across the Middle East. And we're going to work in close cooperation with our European and other partners as we proceed. We'll also work together to lock down fissile and radiological material to prevent terrorist groups from acquiring and using them. Look, the range of challenges Europe and the United States must take on together is broad and complex. And I'm eager to hear next from my good friends and outstanding leaders, Chancellor Merkel, about her thoughts on the way forward together. So let me conclude with this. We cannot allow self-doubt to hinder our ability to engage each other or the larger world. The last 4 years have been hard, but Europe and the United States have to lead with confidence once more, with faith in our capacities, a commitment to our own renewal, with trust in one another, and the ability of Europe and the United States to meet any challenge to secure our futures together. I know we can do this. We've done it before. Just yesterday, after a 7-month, 300 million-mile journey, NASA successfully landed the Perseverance rover on Mars. It's on a mission of exploration, with elements contributed by our European partners to seek evidence of the possibility that life beyond our planet and the mysteries of the universe. Over the next few years, Percy, as it's been called, but Perseverance, will range and collect samples from the red planet and pile them up. So another mission and rover, envisioned as a joint effort between NASA and the European Space Agency, will retrieve this trove of scientific wonders and bring it home to all of us. That's what we can do together. If our unbound capacities to carry us to Mars and back don't tell us anything else, they tell us we can meet any challenge we can face on Earth. We have everything we need. And I want you to know the United States will do our part. We'll stand with you. We'll fight for our shared values. We'll meet the challenges of this new moment in history. America's back. So let's get together and demonstrate to our great-great-grandchildren when they read about us that democracy functions and works, and together there's nothing we can't do. So let's get working. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. President, for this
Thank you, folks.
Extremely important statement. Thank you for presenting it here. And let me add that I look forward to a time, pandemic permitting, that we can try to invite you to fly into Munich again to an in-person conference. I know you used to like these meetings very much, so I look forward to the future. And I also want you and your administration to know that we will, again, conditions permitting, try to continue this discussion later this spring by hopefully bringing a group of senior European decision makers to Washington, D.C. in order for them to meet with members of your administration. So thank you again, Mr. President. Now we're hearing from the other side of the Atlantic, and no one should be surprised if I now turn to the German language. Frau Bundeskanzlerin, ich darf Sie herzlich begrüßen. Es ist mir eine Ehre. Sie haben in diesen Jahren Ihrer Amtszeit häufig hier gesprochen, heute zum ersten Mal in dieser virtuellen Form. Und es freut mich ganz besonders, bei dieser Gelegenheit auch ankündigen zu dürfen, dass wir Sie in diesem Jahr mit dem Ewald von Kleist-Preis der Münchner Sicherheitskonferenz auszeichnen können. Diese Auszeichnung würdigt Ihren herausragenden Beitrag zu Frieden und internationaler Krisenbewältigung. Frau Bundeskanzlerin, Sie haben das Wort.
Ja, sehr geehrter lieber Herr Ischinger, meine Damen und Herren, ich freue mich, heute bei diesem Forum dabei zu sein, was ja etwas ganz Außergewöhnliches ist in verschiedener Hinsicht. Erst einmal im Blick darauf, dass wir in einer Pandemie leben und dass es noch nie notwendig war, anstelle eines physischen Treffens ein solches virtuelles Forum einzuberufen, weil ein Zusammentreffen im Augenblick nicht möglich ist. Ich will aber noch einmal kurz zurückgehen zu meiner Rede vor 2 Jahren, als ich Alexander von Humboldt zitierend gesagt habe, auf ihn berufen habe, und gesagt habe, er hat es benannt, alles ist Wechselwirkung, und hat damit im Grunde vor Jahrhunderten schon darauf hingewiesen, dass das, was wir heute Multilateralismus nennen, nämlich gemeinsame Arbeit, die Grundlage unserer politischen Tätigkeit sein sollten. Und ich glaube, die letzten 2 Jahre haben uns noch einmal vor Augen geführt, dass dieses Bekenntnis zum Multilateralismus richtig und wichtig ist, und die Pandemiebekämpfung zeigt uns das nochmal in ganz besonderer Weise. Herr Tedros von der Weltgesundheitsorganisation ist vorhin hier aufgetreten, und er hat darauf hingewiesen, wenn nicht alle Menschen geimpft werden, wenn das Virus nicht global besiegt ist, dann ist keiner von uns sicher, dann hat keiner die Chance, auch wirklich vor diesem Virus in Sicherheit gebracht zu werden. Wir werden immer wieder Mutationen erleben, und deshalb ist die gleichmäßige und schnelle Versorgung aller Menschen auf der Welt sozusagen eine der Hauptaufgaben, und Deutschland hat gerade bei der G7-Sitzung noch einmal für den ACT-Accelerator und hier insbesondere für die Impffazilität COVAX zusätzliche 1,5 Milliarden Euro zugesagt. Das heißt, insgesamt liegen wir jetzt bei 2,5 Milliarden $, Zusagen für dieses Programm, und tun das auch aus Überzeugung. Die gleichen Herausforderungen wie bei der Pandemiebekämpfung, denen stehen wir natürlich gegenüber im Blick auf Klima, auf Artenvielfalt, auf den Kampf gegen den Terrorismus und mit noch größerer Dringlichkeit als vorher schon im Blick auf die Erfüllung der Nachhaltigkeitsziele, der SDG-Ziele bis zum Jahre 2030. Und all das werden wir nur erreichen können, wenn wir in allen Bereichen unsere Kräfte bündeln und den Sicherheitsbegriff, und das ist ja seitens der Münchner Sicherheitskonferenz durch Sie, Herr Ischinger, schon vor einigen Jahren immer deutlicher geworden, diesen Sicherheitsbegriff als einen Begriff der vernetzten Sicherheit, der multidimensionalen Sicherheit auch zu verstehen. Die Zeichen für Multilateralismus stehen in diesem Jahr sehr viel besser als vor 2 Jahren, und das hat auch sehr viel damit zu tun, dass Joe Biden der Präsident der Vereinigten Staaten von Amerika geworden ist, und seine Rede eben aber auch die Ankündigung seiner Administration, die ersten haben uns davon überzeugt, dass hier nicht nur gesprochen gesprochen wird, sondern dass gehandelt wird. Die Rückkehr zum Pariser Klimaabkommen, die Rückkehr in die Weltgesundheitsorganisation, das Mitwirken im UN-Menschenrechtsrat, die Verlängerung des New Start-Abkommens, die Bereitschaft auch, das Iran-Nuklearabkommen wieder in Gang zu setzen. All das sind wichtige Schritte hin zu mehr multilateraler Zusammenarbeit. Und ich kann nur unterstützen, dass es an den demokratischen Ländern ist, nicht nur über Freiheit, über Werte zu sprechen, sondern eben auch Ergebnisse zu bringen und zu den Ergebnissen von Erfolgen auf der Welt beizutragen. In Deutschland gibt es ein Sprichwort, es gibt nichts Gutes, außer man tut es. Und das ist jetzt die Agenda, vor der wir stehen. Und hier spielt die transatlantische Kooperation natürlich eine zentrale Rolle. Was heißt das jetzt für Deutschland als Land, das die transatlantische Partnerschaft immer unterstützt hat und als Mitgliedsland auch der Europäischen Union? Das heißt, unser Engagement in allen Bereichen fortsetzen und wir müssen auch da handeln, wo man sich anstrengen muss. Und anstrengen, das heißt manchmal auch über den eigenen Schatten springen. Und ich glaube, da sind wir auch in den letzten Jahren einige gute Schritte vorangekommen. 2014 in Wales, als wir über das 2% für die Verteidigungsausgaben gesprochen haben, da haben wir uns ja verpflichtet, in diese Richtung zu arbeiten. Und ich kann heute sagen, dass wir in diesem Jahr jetzt bei 1,5% angekommen sind, nachdem wir 2040 1,1% Verteidigungsausgaben hatten. Und wir fühlen uns natürlich diesem 2%-Ziel weiter verpflichtet und werden auch weiter daran arbeiten. Aber es kommt natürlich auch darauf an, was wir dann in die transatlantische Partnerschaft einbringen. Und ich darf darauf hinweisen, dass Deutschland seit 18 Jahren in Afghanistan an ganz entscheidender Stelle im Norden Afghanistans mit dabei ist, Stabilität zu sichern oder zu erzeugen. Und ich bin sehr dankbar, dass wir jetzt nochmal eine Neubewertung des Friedensprozesses dort in Afghanistan durch die amerikanische Administration haben. Deutschland ist bereit, auch länger in Afghanistan zu bleiben, wenn es der erfolgreichen Mission dient und wenn es uns in eine Position bringt, die auch den demokratischen, den friedensliebenden Kräften in Afghanistan wirklich eine Chance gibt. Der Abzug darf nicht darin enden, dass die falschen Kräfte dort die Oberhand gewinnen. Wir sind Rahmennation in Litauen, wir sind dabei im Kampf gegen den islamistischen Terrorismus, wir sind im Irak engagiert. Deutschland bekennt sich einerseits zur NATO natürlich als dem zentralen transatlantischen Pfeiler, andererseits aber auch zur europäischen Verteidigungspolitik. Für uns ergänzen sich die beiden Elemente, sie stehen nicht gegeneinander, sondern sie ergänzen sich und gehören zusammen. Es gibt aus der Interessenlage der Europäischen Union natürlich Dinge, die für uns von ganz besonderer Wichtigkeit sind. Das ist zum Beispiel unser Engagement auch in Afrika oder die Zukunft Syriens. Wir müssen ja sehen, das sind Länder, die direkt vor der Haustür der Europäischen Union liegen und deshalb uns auch in ganz besonderer Weise tangieren. Deutschland hat sich in den letzten Jahren sehr viel stärker in Afrika engagiert, auch wenn wir sehen müssen, dass gerade Frankreich hier die allermeisten Lasten trägt und wir haben dennoch sind wir dabei bei der UN-Mission MINUSMA, bei der Europäischen Mission zur Ausbildung von Streitkräften in Mali, aber jetzt auch in Niger und wir unterstützen auch die G5 Sahel-Initiative und ich würde mich dafür einsetzen, jetzt auch noch einmal mit den Vereinigten Staaten von Amerika darüber zu sprechen, ob wir diesen Ländern im Kampf gegen den Terrorismus nicht darin helfen, dass wir auch ein Kapitel-7-Mandat der Vereinten Nationen gemeinsam beschließen, was diesen Ländern noch mal sehr viel mehr Unterstützung und Hilfe geben würde im Zusammenhang mit ihrem wirklich schwierigen Kampf gegen den islamistischen Terrorismus. Das Verhältnis zu Afrika ist, glaube ich, von so strategischer Bedeutung, dass es auch ein wichtiges Thema in der transatlantischen Diskussion sein sollte. Und ein Dreh- und Angelpunkt für die Befriedung auch des Kampfes gegen den Terrorismus, gegen den islamistischen Terrorismus ist die Frage, wie entwickeln sich die Dinge in Libyen. Deutschland hat hier mehr diplomatische Verantwortung übernommen. Ich freue mich, dass der UN-Prozess einige Erfolge zeigt, aber wir dürfen da auch nicht blauäugig sein. Immer noch ist die Gefahr groß, dass Libyen sozusagen Spielball von großen Stellvertretermächten wird und nicht Libyen den Libyern wirklich mit einer politischen Zukunft gehört. Und die Europäische Union setzt sich dafür ein, aber ich denke auch transatlantisch sollten wir uns dafür einsetzen, dass Libyen und seine Zukunft den Libyern gehören. Wir müssen voranbringen den Verfassungsprozess, auch durch die Vereinten Nationen geleitet, für Syrien, denn es wird auch hier nur eine friedliche Lösung in Syrien geben, wenn die vielen Menschen, die Syrien verlassen mussten, auch wieder eine politische Zukunft in ihrem Heimatland bekommen. Und wir werden natürlich sehr eng zusammenarbeiten im JCPOA, in dem Nuklearabkommen mit dem Iran. Ich hoffe, dass diesem Abkommen eine Chance gegeben werden kann. Die transatlantische Partnerschaft hat dann zwei große Aufgaben, über die wir unsere gemeinsamen Strategien entwickeln müssen. Das ist einmal das Verhältnis zu Russland. Wir sind im Blick auf die Souveränität und territoriale Integrität der Ukraine in den letzten Jahren nicht vorangekommen. Und der Minsker Prozess ist zwar ein diplomatisches Mittel, aber die Fortschritte lassen zu wünschen übrig. Russland verwickelt immer wieder Mitgliedstaaten der Europäischen Union in hybride Auseinandersetzungen und deshalb ist es ganz wichtig, dass wir hier eine gemeinsame transatlantische Russland-Agenda entwickeln, die einerseits natürlich auch kooperative Angebote macht, aber auf der anderen Seite auch ganz klar die Unterschiede benennt, und ich kann hier dem amerikanischen Präsidenten nur zustimmen, was auch die Frage einer starken Europäischen Union ist. Daran arbeitet Russland leider zurzeit nicht. Das Zweite und vielleicht noch kompliziertere ist, dass wir eine gemeinsame Agenda gegenüber China entwickeln. China ist auf der einen Seite systemischer Wettbewerber, auf der anderen Seite brauchen wir China für die Lösung globaler Probleme wie des Themas Artenvielfalt, wie des Themas Klimaschutz. Und China hat in den letzten Jahren eben auch an globaler Schlagkraft gewonnen, und dem müssen wir als transatlantisches Bündnis und als Demokratien der Welt dann auch etwas an Taten entgegensetzen. Deshalb ist zum Beispiel die Frage der Impfstofflieferung jetzt nicht nur aus China und Russland an Länder, die Entwicklungsländer sind wichtig, sondern eben auch die Frage, was können wir über COVAX und was können wir auch als multilaterale Gemeinschaft wie G7 zum Beispiel einsetzen, um das Impfen für Entwicklungsländer, gerade auch in Afrika, voranzubringen. Wir müssen die multilateralen Organisationen wie Weltbank, wie die Welthandelsorganisation, die Weltgesundheitsorganisation, den Internationalen Währungsfonds wieder stärken. Überall dort, wo wir schwach waren, wo wir uns nicht schnell genug entscheiden konnten, auch Veränderungen vorzunehmen, Kapitalerhöhungen vorzunehmen, sind auch subsidiäre Strukturen oder andere Strukturen im asiatischen Raum oft unter der Federführung Chinas entstanden, und wir müssen durch Taten eben überzeugen, dass wir dem etwas auch entgegensetzen. Es geht also darum, dass wir gemeinsam die strategischen Herausforderungen definieren. Ich glaube, die Agenda ist klar, und dass wir da auch gemeinsame Vorgehensweisen entwickeln. Das wird nicht immer Interessengleichheit sein. Ich mache mir darüber keine Illusionen, da muss man auch offen über die Differenzen sprechen, aber vom Grundansatz, von der Wertebasis, von der Überzeugung von der Demokratie und ihrer Handlungsfähigkeit haben wir ein breites, gutes, gemeinsames Fundament, und wir müssen zeigen, dass wir nicht Länder in Abhängigkeiten bringen wollen, sondern dass wir überzeugen wollen von unserer Art zu leben und von unserer Art Politik zu machen. Und deshalb ist die transatlantische Perspektive hier für mich der Kern dieser Bemühungen. Und ich darf nur sagen, es gibt sehr viel zu tun. Deutschland steht für ein neues Kapitel der transatlantischen Partnerschaft bereit, und ich freue mich, das hier auf diesem Forum der Münchner Sicherheitskonferenz heute sagen zu dürfen. Herzlichen Dank.
Vielen Dank, Frau Bundeskanzlerin. Das ist eine sicher viele erfreuende, positive transatlantische Message. Ganz herzlichen Dank dafür. Und jetzt gehen wir direkt von Berlin nach Paris. I have the pleasure now to welcome the President of the French Republic, Emmanuel Macron, after being our guest at the Munich conference in this very hall a year ago. This is his second time to speak to us. President Macron will make a statement in French, and he has agreed to take some questions after that in English. So now, Monsieur le Président, vous avez la parole. Je suis très content d'avoir vous de nouveau à Munich. Merci beaucoup.
President Macron, you have the floor. It's a pleasure to have you again here in Munich.
Beaucoup, Monsieur l'ambassadeur, heureux d'être là et de pouvoir juste dire quelques mots peut-être avant de répondre à vos questions, suite à ce que le président Biden et la chancelière Merkel viennent d'exprimer et dans lequel je me retrouve pleinement. Écoutez, vous nous lancez un défi au fond qui est de savoir comment l'alliance transatlantique et comment l'Ouest peut être utile. Moi, je pense que nous avons un common destiny, en tout cas un rôle historique aujourd'hui. Et je voudrais juste, au fond, partager deux grandes idées. La première chose que nous devons faire, me semble-t-il, entre Américains et Européens qui se retrouvons à nouveau avec une volonté commune d'avancer, de partager les mêmes valeurs, la première chose, c'est d'avoir un multilatéralisme qui produit des résultats, qui soit utile. En matière de climat, Joe et Angela l'ont parfaitement dit, en matière de préservation de nos démocraties, et tout particulièrement quand il s'agit d'ailleurs de préserver la liberté d'expression et d'éviter la haine, le retour de la haine dans nos démocraties, et la question d'ailleurs de la régulation du numérique est ainsi posée, elle est, je pense, vitale pour nos démocraties. La question aussi du traitement des inégalités, parce que je pense que si nous voulons faire réussir notre mondialisation, et en particulier l'Ouest ne réussira pas l'Alliance transatlantique sans ses voisins, ses voisinages, en particulier l'Afrique, nous devons régler le problème des inégalités dans nos sociétés avec nos voisins. C'est la question de, en particulier, la réponse économique à cette crise. C'est notre agenda avec l'Afrique, c'est notre agenda au FMI pour plaider pour des droits de tirage spéciaux et une augmentation forte. C'est notre agenda de restructuration des dettes africaines, c'est vital. Et puis, évidemment, c'est notre agenda en matière de santé. Là aussi, je rejoins totalement ce que le président Biden et la chancelière Merkel viennent de dire. Nous avons un défi collectif. Nous avons passé les premières étapes, nous coordonner pour protéger nos populations, réussir à innover de manière inédite pour inventer des nouveaux vaccins et maintenant les déployer dans nos pays. Je pense que si nous voulons réussir un multilatéralisme qui produit des résultats, le défi qui nous est posé, c'est à nous, Européens, Américains, de permettre à tous les pays du monde, pauvres et émergents, d'accéder le plus vite possible au diagnostic, au traitement, aux vaccins et d'améliorer leur système de santé. C'est au cœur de l'initiative Act A, lancée en mars 2020 avec l'Organisation mondiale de la santé. C'est le défi qui est le nôtre aujourd'hui. Nous avons, lors du G7, il y a quelques instants, annoncé des sommes importantes, fait, je crois, un pas en avant, très fort, mais il y a une idée toute simple que je défends. Après avoir échangé avec nos partenaires africains, le continent africain a 6,5 millions de soignants. Il faut 13 millions de doses de vaccins pour les protéger et permettre au système de soins de résister. Si nous, Européens, Américains, nous savons livrer le plus vite possible ces 13 millions de doses, ça vaut énormément. Ça vaut notre crédibilité. Ça représente 0,43% des doses que nous avons commandées. Si nous savons faire ça, alors l'Ouest aura une présence et sera considéré en Afrique. Si nous annonçons des milliards aujourd'hui pour donner des doses dans 6 mois, dans 8 mois, dans 1 an, nos amis africains auront sous la pression de la population et à juste titre acheté des doses aux Chinois, aux Russes ou directement à d'autres laboratoires. Et la force de l'Ouest, des Européens ou des Américains, ce sera un concept mais pas une réalité. Et donc je pense que c'est une idée très concrète, très importante. Le deuxième pilier pour moi de notre destinée commune, du travail que nous avons à faire en commun entre Européens et Américains, c'est au fond de bâtir un agenda de sécurité. Angela Merkel a dit en détail beaucoup de choses sur les différentes situations régionales. Je partage absolument ce qui a été dit par Madame la chancelière. Et donc je ne vais pas répéter ce qui a été très bien dit par elle. Je veux simplement dire, pour moi, on a sur l'agenda de sécurité commun, trois choses à faire ensemble. La première, c'est de bâtir, de rebâtir l'agenda et l'architecture de sécurité ensemble. C'est-à-dire le nouveau concept de l'OTAN. Moi, je crois que tout ce que je vous ai dit l'année dernière reste valide. Les questionnements, les doutes qu'on peut avoir, les défis qui sont devant nous. Il y a un travail qui a été fait par un comité des sages, c'est le rôle des États et des chefs d'État et de gouvernement de s'en saisir pour préparer le nouveau concept qui structurera notre action au sein de l'OTAN dans les prochaines années et bâtira les fondements de cette architecture de sécurité. L'architecture de sécurité commune, c'est aussi le dialogue avec la Russie, qui ne doit pas être complaisant, exigeant, mais qui est la clé pour que la plaque européenne puisse vivre en paix. La deuxième chose, c'est de pouvoir fixer les situations régionales. Et donc, du Sahel, où nous sommes très présents et nous battons contre le djihadisme, jusqu'à l'Irak, situation extrêmement importante pour nous, la Syrie, ou le Nagorno-Karabakh, la Méditerranée orientale et plusieurs autres sujets. Comment on bâtit la sécurité et comment on agit ensemble de manière coordonnée, en respectant tous les alliés, de manière absolue, ce qui n'a pas toujours été le cas ces derniers mois. Et donc, comment nous avançons ensemble pour résoudre ces situations entre alliés, mais aussi entre membres permanents du Conseil de sécurité, entre partenaires, pour justement bâtir des solutions communes. L'Iran sera aussi évidemment une situation importante. Et puis le troisième grand défi qui est le nôtre, c'est de maintenir ce que j'appellerais la liberté de la souveraineté. Maintenir la liberté de la souveraineté, c'est une formule que j'emprunte à l'ancien Premier ministre Turnbull, l'ancien Premier ministre d'Australie, et cela vaut pour l'action que nous avons à mener ensemble dans le cyber, dans l'espace maritime, dans l'espace, justement parce que ce sont des nouvelles zones de conflictualité, et défendre la liberté de la souveraineté, c'est agir ensemble pour y être présent, préserver notre espace, et c'est aussi le cœur de notre agenda commun en matière d'Indo-Pacifique. Nous n'avons pas toujours les mêmes approches exactement de cette notion, mais au fond, pour moi, l'objectif que nous devons poursuivre dans cette région, c'est la liberté de la souveraineté. Voilà, résoudre les conflits régionaux, préserver dans les grands espaces de conflictualité la liberté de la souveraineté pour chacun, bâtir une architecture de sécurité et de confiance. Voilà pour moi les éléments clés de cet agenda de sécurité qui est le nôtre. Je ne serai pas plus long parce que je vais pouvoir répondre à vos questions, cher ambassadeur.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Thank you, and I think we indeed have time for a few questions. So let me start with a conceptual question. You have explained on several occasions what the concept of strategic autonomy should mean and could mean for Europe, for the European Union. This concept is speaking here at a transatlantic event, is interpreted by some in the United States as an attempt by Europe to move away from the United States, alienating itself from the US, potentially even damaging NATO. Could you explain to us and to our American listeners why this concept should not stand and would not stand in the way of repairing transatlantic cooperation and trust?
The opposite, indeed. First, because when you look at the burden sharing within NATO, a large part of the investment, a large part of the commitments were made by the US. This is why, as Chancellor Merkel fairly said, we have to increase our defense investments. We will reach in the coming month the 2% of our GDP in defense expenditures. And I think this is very important because this is the way to rebalance the transatlantic relation and to provide the evidence to our US friends that we are reliable and responsible partners. And I think having a European Union much more invested in defense makes us much more credible as members of NATO. This is the first point. We reduce the net contribution of the US in the partnership. We take our responsibility, we provide the evidence, we are reliable. The second point is that when you look today at the situation, we need more Europe to deal with our neighborhood. I listened very carefully to President Biden and the common challenges. We do have common challenges in Africa, in Middle East. But we have an agenda which could be not totally different, but with, I would say, perhaps not the same level of priority. One of President Biden's predecessors said at a point of time, now the US is become a Pacific power, meaning looking at China and the Pacific Ocean. It means that it will refocus the US to other regions than our neighborhood. During decades, the US within NATO was totally focused on Europe, defense of Europe, and our neighborhood. And I think it is time for us to take much more of the burden of our own protection. Europe, the European Union, its key members, have to be part of the solution of their own security. When we speak about this architecture of trust and security, when we discuss with Russia or China about ballistic missiles or missiles involving our countries, we should be part of the negotiation. When we speak about security at our borders, it is normal that sometimes the US could decide to be less involved. If we are too much dependent in the US within NATO, we can put ourselves in the situation to be no more protected at our borders. And we experienced this situation in 2013, de facto, in Syria. So I think we have to be trustful partner. I do believe in NATO. I do believe NATO needs a new political momentum and clarification of its strategic concept. And NATO needs more political approach. And I do believe that the best possible involvement of Europe within NATO is to be much more in charge of its own security and to be much more in charge of this strategic autonomy. This is totally compatible. More than that, given the arguments I just presented, I think it will make NATO even stronger than before.
Mr. President, I wish I could keep asking you questions. The television people tell me that we've already run out of time. So the only thing I can say is first, thank you very, very much. Merci beaucoup. And please, when we have a chance, pandemic permitting, to meet again in Munich, please take our next invitation seriously. I would very much love to continue this enormously interesting discussion. Thank you, Monsieur le Président. And now back to Nathalie.
We've heard priorities that the United States, Germany and France each see on the agenda, on the transatlantic agenda. But what about the role of two large international organizations which are at the center of any transatlantic partnership, the EU and NATO?
The current president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. When she was still German Minister of Defense, she made one thing clear in Munich. German security policy is only conceivable with close allies.
Wir leben in einer Welt,
it is important to have partners in this world that we live in. We're currently experiencing powerful dynamics. We know that we must do more,
dass wir noch mehr tun müssen, gerade wir Deutschen.
This was about Germany's role in NATO. Last year, the NATO Secretary General called for unity in the transatlantic alliance.
I don't believe in Europe alone, as I don't believe in America alone. I believe in Europe and America together.
Like Ursula von der Leyen, he is also one of the regulars at the Munich Security Conference.
Next segment of our program is devoted to the European Union and to NATO, the key defining institutions that help us navigate through the crisis of the past and of the future. It's my great pleasure now to welcome the President of the Commission of the European Union, Ursula von der Leyen, who has, in fact, participated in every single Munich Security Conference since 2014. Without further ado, I don't want to lose more time here. Over to you, Madam President. You have the floor.
Over to you. Thank you so much, lieber Wolfgang Ischinger. Ladies and gentlemen, indeed, I vividly remember how 2 years ago Joe Biden promised at the Munich Security Conference, we will be back. And indeed, we've just seen and heard it, the US is back. And as we've also just heard, more globally committed than ever. This commitment couldn't come at a better time. How we come out of this crisis will have profound consequences for our citizens, for our economies, and also for the position of our common alliance in the post-COVID world. And let me give you 2 examples for what could be driving our new global agenda. The first example is climate change. Climate change is the looming crisis behind COVID. And the loss of biodiversity is a main driver of today's and potentially future pandemics. More than a year ago, Europe has said that it wants to become the first climate neutral continent by 2050. And with our European Green Deal, we want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% already by 2030. But to successfully fight global climate change, we need others to match our ambition. And they do. From South Korea to Japan, from South Africa to China, and we are really excited that President Biden rejoined the Paris Agreement on his very first day in office. Because the United States is our natural partner for global leadership on climate change. And I'm sure a shared transatlantic commitment to a net zero emissions pathway by 2050 would make climate neutrality a new global benchmark. And it would be a timely message in the run-up to the COP26, the next UN climate change conference, to be held in Glasgow later this year. We've just heard it. I also commend President Biden's initiative to host a Climate Leaders Summit on Earth Day, because now is the time for action. And this is also true when it comes to the digital world and the impact it has on our democracies. And this is my second example. The storming on the US Capitol was a turning point for our discussion on the impact social media have on our democracies. This is what happens when words incite action. In a world where polarizing opinions are the most likely to be heard, it is only a short step from crude conspiracy theories to the death of police officers. In September, the Commission launched the Digital Services Act and the Digital Market Act, our new framework for the digital market. And of course, imposing democratic limits on the uncontrolled power of the big tech companies alone will not stop political violence, but it is an important step. At its most basic, we want to make sure that what is illegal offline is also illegal online. And we want clear requirements that internet firms take responsibility for the content they distribute, promote, and remove. Because we just cannot leave decisions which have a huge impact on our democracies to computer programs without any human supervision or to the boardrooms in Silicon Valley. And the latest decision on Facebook regarding Australia is just another proof for that. Today, I want to invite our American friends to join our initiatives. Together, we could create a digital economy rule book that is valid worldwide. A set of rules based on our values,
human rights and pluralism, inclusion, and the protection of privacy. We need to join forces and protect these values with all our energy. Ladies and gentlemen, a more and more assertive China has shown robust economic growth in 2020, despite the pandemic. And a more and more defiant Russia continues to breach international rules at home and abroad, despite growing protests of its own citizens. It is up to us, the United States and Europe, to strengthen our cooperation again as proven and trusted partners, as indispensable allies, shoulder to shoulder, because if we lead the way, this is not only about joining forces, this is a signal to the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Thank you very much. As you know very well, we have this wonderful program, the Munich Young Leaders, which is co-organized by the Kober Foundation. And the first question that we would like to put to you comes from one of our Munich Young Leaders, from Caroline Schmutte from Germany. Caroline, please.
The European Union and the United States have a long and fruitful history of cooperation, and it's great to see that energy back under President Biden. However, both sides turned recently inwards, for example by competing against each other on vaccines. How do you plan to use this new transatlantic energy to lead the European Union out of the pandemic into a strong recovery and to tackle global issues together with the United States?
Thank you, Caroline. Madam President.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this question. And indeed, first of all, the story of vaccinations for me is not one of competition. To the contrary, it is one of unprecedented cooperation. You might remember last year, Europe convened 2 pledging sessions with a result of 16 billion euro to fight COVID. And we were joined by more than 40 countries, but also by NGOs like Global Citizen and foundations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation or the Wellcome Trust, for example. And together with WHO, we put in place the ACT Accelerator and COVAX. You all know the facility where high-income countries finance access to vaccines for low- and middle-income countries. And just 2 hours ago at the meeting of the G7, we doubled our funding to COVAX, and it was exciting to see the pledging of the United States. Indeed, the United States are back. And Europe is also the continent, that's the second aspect, that produces and exports the most vaccines to the rest of the world. So this also shows that we are walking the talk. We're leading by the power of our example. And finally, yes, you're right. Let's commit to invest in a strong economic recovery, a recovery that is digital and sustainable, fair and inclusive. And you heard President Biden. This is why we in Europe just built our recovery package, Next Generation EU, we call it. It's 1.8 trillion euro. It is for the European Green Deal and digitalization, because it's good for transatlantic partnership, but it's also most important for our children's future. We are investing in, because they have a right to a modern world and a healthier planet.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for one last and brief question, and I'd like to go to the issue of trade. What are your priorities, if I may ask, for the future transatlantic trade agenda? Are you in favor, for example, of taking another shot at TTIP? Or what other low-hanging fruit can you identify out there? What's your proposal?
Well, trade is a wide subject where we are having many trade agreements worldwide. And indeed, I don't think that TTIP will be revived. because we are not there where the United States left us 4 years ago anymore. The world has changed, the United States have changed, and Europe have changed. But let me also have a look at what our impact in geopolitics is, not only on the point of trade, but also on other topics. So the European Union is an economic superpower. It is the most important export market on the US, India, South Africa, Russia, just to name a few. And when it comes to Africa, it's not China, but Europe is the largest economic partner by far. And we are, by the way, the #1 global regulator. Just recently we have proposed to set up, indeed, an EU-US Trade and Technology Council. Because we know that those who write global rules are the ones who are shaping the future of their societies. And you heard the president. None of us wants China to do this for us. So I think doing it together, shaping our trade and technology agenda, is the right way to go. A new global agenda, a more globally oriented US, and a more capable Europe. This is how we can tackle the challenges, and Europe is ready for this.
Thank you so much. Thank you, President von der Leyen. Actually, we stay in Brussels now and go from the Commission straight to the President of the European Council. Bonjour, Monsieur le Président, President Charles Michel. As President of the Council, I need to look in this camera, right? As President of the Council, Mr. President, you have the authority and the mission to pull together the 27 heads of state and government when it comes to taking strategic decisions on behalf of the entire European Union. So we're all excited to hear from you, Mr. President, where you see your priorities and transatlantic priorities going forward.
First of all, I want to thank you, Ambassador Ischinger. It's a great initiative to bring together again transatlantic partners to discuss the great challenges ahead. In the last 75 years, the relationship between Europe and the United States has been the backbone of the rules-based international order. This partnership is underpinned by multiple pillars: our security and defense alliance through NATO, our strong economic cooperation, and of course, the rich relationship between our peoples. This is a critical time for Europe, for the United States, and for the world. And we are confronted by massive challenges. And this makes our alliance with the US both vibrant and vital. And again, it's more necessary than ever. This is why the European Council, all the 27 European leaders together, have reaffirmed its strategic importance. And I believe both sides now want to rejuvenate and solidify our bond. I call it a new founding pact. It's worth reflecting on what the fundamentals of this pact should be. I sum it up in 3 words: values, prosperity, and influence. First, our values. Together, our values are those of the free world: human dignity, democracy, freedom, and the rule of law. These values represent the cornerstone of our relationship. If our relationship went through 4 bumpy years, it was not because of differences of views or interests. These are normal. Rather, it was because respecting rules and respecting agreements were no longer a given. And that's why we appreciate the commitment expressed by President Biden. We will lead not merely by the example of our power, but by the power of our example. It's precisely when we respect our common values, when we respect each other as equal partners, that we can resolve our differences. It's precisely when those values are challenged by others that we must lead by example to defend them and promote them at home and abroad. Today, recovering from COVID-19 is our first priority. And more than ever, we must show our peoples that our system of free societies and open economies works, and that it works for all. We, the EU and US, need to join forces to make trade, digital development, green transition, and fair taxation contribute to greater prosperity and well-being for our citizens. We want to build back a better, fairer, and greener world for all, and this is our European ambition. And we think international cooperation is the only way to succeed. Now that America, under the Biden-Harris administration, we join this common endeavor, our alliance, along with our like-minded partners, constitutes a formidable and influential power. When we are on the same page, we have greater influence to promote democracy and drive forward our economies. Together we are stronger to defend the rules-based international order from the attacks of autocratic regimes, whether from Russia, China, or Iran. And we are stronger to ensure peace and security. When we share the same view of prosperity and well-being, we have greater capacity to deal with major economic actors, to bring them to more fairness and reciprocity while avoiding detrimental competition between ourselves. A strong partnership needs strong partners, and that's why we in Europe are growing stronger to increase our strategic ability to act for our common values, for more prosperity and for more security. We want to be a strong and reliable partner. Let's make our partnership a powerhouse for a better world. Welcome back, America. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you very much. But if you allow, let me push you just a little bit on this agenda. There are so many issues out there, as have been presented by President Biden, by your colleague Ursula von der Leyen, by Chancellor Merkel, etc. In your view, which ones are the single most important issues that deserve to be tackled between Brussels and Washington in the weeks, months, and hopefully the year or the 2 years to come?
Certainly the first priority for us is to work together at the international level, because we think that we need to work in order to develop more prosperity. It means that we need to develop the economic cooperation, and Ursula gave a very good example with the digital transition, the digital agenda. We think indeed that data will be the resource number one of the 21st century, and we think at the same time that we need to facilitate, to encourage the exchange of data. But we think also that it's important to guarantee that the way the personal data will be used will be accepted by the citizens. The confidence of our citizens is key for the future. On the one hand, we need to develop the innovation, to develop the prosperity based on the artificial intelligence, on the digital transition. On the other hand, we need to guarantee the fundamental freedoms, the fundamental democratic values. I think this is a good example for strong cooperation with the United States and all the other like-minded partners. Certainly climate change is another topic. I don't speak too much about that because we know that the fact that the United States has decided to rejoin the Paris Agreement is a very strong signal, a very strong message. And my third point is certainly the security topics, the geopolitical topics, China, Russia, how we can work together in order to make sure that we have more positive influence for a better world and in order to promote our strong democratic values.
Thank you very much, President Michel. I really appreciate your willingness to participate in this program this afternoon. I'm sure we could continue for lengthy more questions, but we've actually run out of time. I regret with President Macron, we had the same problem a few minutes ago. So thank you very, very much for your willingness, and we will see you again in the Munich Security Conference going forward, I'm quite sure. So now we stay in Brussels actually, but we go from the European Union to NATO. And it's my pleasure to welcome a good old friend, if I may call him that, of the Munich Security Conference, the Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg. Welcome, Jens. I'm delighted that you are able to join us also today in this rapid fire program. You've just hosted NATO defense ministers with the new U.S. Secretary of Defense in his first appearance at NATO. So very exciting things are going on. Please, Jens, share with us your vision for the future.
Thank you so much, Wolfgang, for that kind introduction. I'm really delighted to be part of this special edition of the Munich Security Conference at an important juncture in transatlantic relations. We have heard from President Biden and from European leaders, and I look forward to hosting them at our NATO summit in Brussels later this year to set a new transatlantic agenda. In recent years, we have seen differences between Europe and North America, with serious questions asked about the strength of our alliance on both sides of the Atlantic and competing visions of the transatlantic relations. We now have an historic opportunity to build a stronger alliance, to regain trust and to reinforce our unity. Europe and North America working together in NATO, in strategic solidarity. Because we are facing great challenges. The rise of China, sophisticated cyber attacks, disruptive technologies, climate change, Russia's destabilizing behavior, and the continuing threat of terrorism. No country and no continent can go it alone. On the contrary, we must do more together. And we have to demonstrate our commitment to transatlantic solidarity, not just in words, but in deeds. That is why, under the banner of NATO 2030, we are working on an ambitious agenda for the future of our alliance. First, we must reinforce our unity. That unity derives from our promise to defend each other. We must strengthen our commitment to our collective defense and fund more of deterrence and defense on NATO territory together. This would incentivize allies to provide the necessary capabilities and contribute to fairer burden sharing. NATO is the unique platform that brings Europe and North America together every day. Allies should commit to consult on all issues that affect our security. We should update NATO's strategic concept to chart a common course going forward and reaffirm the fundamentals of our alliance. Second, we must broaden our approach to security. Our potential adversaries use all the tools at their disposal, military, political, economic, to challenge our institutions, weaken our societies, and undermine our security. Of course, to keep our people safe, we need strong military. But we also need strong societies. As our first line of defense, we need a broader, more integrated and better coordinated approach to resilience, with concrete national targets, for communications, including 5G and undersea cables, energy and water supplies, and a joint assessment of any vulnerabilities. We also need to invest to maintain our technological edge, ensure our forces remain interoperable, and develop ethical standards on the use of new disruptive technologies. Broadening our approach to security also means addressing the security impact of climate change. I believe NATO should set the gold standard on how to reduce the emissions of our militaries, contributing to the goal of net zero. And third, Europe and North America must defend the international rules-based order, which is being challenged by authoritarian powers. China and Russia are trying to rewrite the rules of the road to benefit their own interests. The rise of China is a defining issue for the transatlantic community, with potential consequences for our security, our prosperity, and our way of life. This is why NATO should deepen our relationships with close partners like Australia and Japan, and forge new ones around the world. Only through concerted action can we encourage others to play by the rules. Defending our rules-based orders starts by defending our values at home. We must recommit to our values, strengthen our democracies, and protect our institutions. Because ultimately, this is what makes us who we are. For over 70 years, NATO has secured peace in the Euro-Atlantic area. Despite evolving challenges and changing political winds, our transatlantic relationship has not only endured, it has flourished. This is a testament to the values we share and to NATO, the embodiment of our transatlantic bond. We all have a responsibility to seize this moment, to strengthen that bond, and to keep Europe and North America together in strategic solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary General. I know you are familiar with our Munich Young Leaders Group, and you will probably not be surprised that we have young leaders even at NATO. The first question, therefore, will be asked by one of our young leaders who happens to be working at the Polish mission to NATO. This is my friend Dominik Jankowski. So, Dominik, why don't you go ahead and ask your question?
Secretary General, in the era of great power competition, NATO needs friends and partners. But the alliance will face all the new threats. How should NATO adapt its military posture until 2030 in order to deter the challenges and threats of today and tomorrow?
Secretary General, please.
Well, NATO has already implemented the biggest reinforcement of our collective defense in Europe with the new battle groups in the eastern part of the alliance, including in Poland. We have increased the readiness of forces, and allies are, after years of cutting defense spending, all allies are now investing in more. We need also to make sure that we maintain our technological edge. So anything we can do on innovation, on understand the full impact of artificial intelligence, quantum computing, autonomous weapon systems for our security is of course also about our collective defense in Europe. I think the most important thing is that we stay committed to Article 5 and sending a very clear message to any potential adversary that an attack on one ally will trigger the response from the whole alliance. And that's exactly what we can do by further strengthening our collective defense in Europe.
Thank you very much. Second question comes from another young leader, Kati Piri is actually a member of the European Parliament. She's from the Netherlands. Kati, your question, please.
Secretary General, disinformation has emerged as a crucial challenge to our democracies. Certain state actors, including Russia and China, have made use of the uncertainties of the COVID-19 pandemic to actively undermine faith in NATO and the European Union, governmental institutions, and the democratic system. Now, what actions should NATO member states take to ensure the integrity of their democracies? And what additional action could be taken at the level of NATO?
Secretary General, please.
Well, I think the use of disinformation is just one example of how our adversaries are using the whole range of the tools for their disposal. Military means, economic means, political means, but also disinformation. And of course we need to respond to that by focusing more on the resilience of our societies. Strong societies are less vulnerable to disinformation. That's exactly why in the NATO 2030 agenda, resilience is the first line of defense and something we are focusing on as we prepare for the upcoming summit later on this year with all the NATO leaders. But fundamentally, I think that the best way to respond to disinformation is to make sure that we have a free and independent press, journalists that ask the different and difficult questions, that are able to check their sources and make sure that disinformation never prevails. The truth will prevail as long as we have a free and independent press.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for one or two brief additional questions. Let me ask one on the relationship between NATO and the European Union. I know, Jens, that you've been very, very strongly engaged in creating better institutional and operational links between the two organizations. Describe to us, if you could, in a few words, how you see this going forward, and could close NATO-EU cooperation also provide the kind of framework for all of us meeting the challenge of China, because I'm not so sure everybody will want to have only NATO as the organization responsible for handling this relationship, and maybe only the European Union will also not be sufficient to cover the whole ground. Please.
Over the last years, we have been able to lift the cooperation between NATO and the European Union up to unprecedented levels, and I really welcome that. And that's because of the political will from the European Union side and from the NATO side. We work on issues like cyber, fighting terrorism, exercises, maritime security, and on many other issues. And I think that in the future we will need even more cooperation, NATO and the European Union. You mentioned the security impact of the rise of China, and you are absolutely right. Neither NATO nor the European Union has all the tools we need to address the consequences of the rise of China. We need to work together. Resilience, technology, also areas where there is obvious need for more cooperation between EU and the European and NATO. And I also very much support and welcome the efforts by the European Union on defense, because I really believe that more EU efforts on defense can provide new capabilities, can try to reduce the fragmentation of the European defense industry, which will be good for all of us, and can also increase defense spending. So this is something I support and encourage and welcome very much. Increased defense spending, for instance, in Europe is something that NATO has been calling for many, many years. Now actually it happens. But EU cannot replace NATO. EU cannot protect Europe. This is partly about resources. 20% of NATO's defense spending is coming from EU and NATO allies. It's also partly about geography. Norway and Iceland in the north, or Turkey in the south, or in the west, United States, Canada, and United Kingdom. These countries are, of course, important for the defense, the protection of Europe. And thirdly, it's about politics. Any attempt to weaken the transatlantic bond will not only weaken NATO, it will also divide Europe. So we have to have Europe and North America together in NATO. That's the best way, and especially in light of the rising challenges related to terrorism, cyber, but not least the changing global balance of power with the rise of China. And we are very much together. We have to remember that more than 90% of the people living in the European Union, they live in a NATO country. So we really have to work together. And we have a unique opportunity now to strengthen that cooperation, a new transatlantic chapter. I think the message in this conference today has been exactly that, a positive message about working together. And as Secretary General of NATO, I welcome that very much.
Jens, I think I have time for one last question. Normally, when we meet at the Munich Security Conference, you would be talking to an expert group of foreign ministers and national security advisors. Today, of course, this program is being broadcast to the wider public. So I'm going to ask you a question that I think is of interest to the wider public. Our previous speakers spent a lot of time talking about climate change, the challenge of it. That is one of the biggest challenges for the global community. Any role for NATO in climate change?
Yes, absolutely. And again, our NATO 2030 agenda is how to make climate change and the security impact of climate change an important, more important issue for NATO. In my previous capacity, before I became Secretary General of NATO, actually I had the privilege of being the UN Special Envoy on climate change. And therefore, I see very clearly the relationship between climate change and security. We often say that global warming, more extreme weather, that's a crisis multiplier. And crisis creates threats, and therefore climate change matters for our security. NATO has at least three things we should do. First, we need to fully understand the security consequences, assess, map, analyze the security consequences. We should be the organization bringing Europe and North America together to have the expertise, the knowledge on the security consequences of climate change. Second, we need to adapt our missions and operations. We know that a lot of military infrastructure will be directly impacted by global warming, rising sea levels. So this will have direct consequences for how we invest, where we can have our bases, especially naval bases. But also, for instance, we're now increasing our training mission in Iraq. In Baghdad last summer, it was more than 50 degrees Celsius for many, many days. Of course, this will impact the way we organize our missions, equipment, uniforms. Ice is melting, it impacts how we can operate in the high north. So climate change is directly impacting our missions and operations. We need to adapt to that. And thirdly, NATO should be part of the solution. We have a responsibility to contribute to reduced emissions. And therefore, I think that our militaries, NATO, should aim at becoming part of the net zero goal. This is therefore one of my proposals for the heads of state and government, that actually we should make climate change an important issue. Reduce emissions from military operations is a way to address climate change, but actually less dependence on fossil fuels would also make our military operations more resilient and reduce vulnerabilities. So security and climate goes hand in hand as we address it in NATO.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary General. This last issue, of course, leads us wonderfully into the next segment. My job now is to say thank you to you. See you at our next in-person Munich Security Conference. Over to Natalie.
We've heard it right now. The world is facing another great danger, the climate change. The scientific consensus is that climate change will alter the ecological balance of life on Earth, changing it in ways that could be catastrophic for many life forms that share the Earth with us. Another very real challenge
that can only be overcome together.
John Kerry has demonstrated time and again that climate policy is close to his heart. For instance, at the Security Conference in 2020. Back then, he expressed his sympathy for Greta Thunberg and the activists of Fridays for Future.
And it infuriates me that these kids have to be out in the streets asking adults to be adults. We should be ashamed of ourselves all around the world.
As of late, he's been fighting global warming in an official capacity as Special Presidential Envoy for Climate.
Today is actually the day, as was said half an hour ago by President Biden, the day the United States officially rejoins the Paris Climate Agreement. It's a fitting moment to welcome the new U.S. Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, longtime friend of the Munich Security Conference, member even of our Advisory Council, and of course, former Secretary of State. Welcome, John Kerry. Please, John.
Wolfgang, thank you very, very much. Thank you for a great introduction. Thank you for, importantly, making sure that climate change is front and center at the Munich Security Conference, which is exactly where it belongs today. Climate change, as we just heard from Jens Stoltenberg, is a security issue. And the fact is, it's among the most complex security issues we've ever faced. What we do or don't do in the coming months and years will make all the difference. But for millions of people, Wolfgang, they don't have to look into a distant future to see the impacts of climate change now. They just have to look out the window. This week in the state of Texas, we've seen unprecedented extreme cold related to climate because the polar vortex penetrates further south because of the weakening of the jet stream related to warming. Last year, the U.S. saw a record 30 named tropical cyclones. Europe is warming even faster than the global average, and the melting Arctic ice has changed geostrategic and military calculations for every country on the planet, from Russia to China, and obviously for NATO. And what these extreme weather events translate to on the ground should concern every single one of us. Climate change is, again, as Jens said, it's a threat multiplier. When tensions are already high somewhere and resources are increasingly scarce, the embers of conflict just burn brighter. And when farmers can no longer make a living because the weather is so extreme and unpredictable, they become increasingly desperate. Many, according to some studies, hundreds of millions of people will be forced from their homes, forced from their habitat, from the place they've lived a lifetime. And not only can mass migration drive humanitarian crisis, but as Europe knows only too well, as we saw with Turkey's manipulation of the numbers of people being released and people being pushed out of Syria, if it is not managed well, it can literally begin to undermine countries' homes, peace, and stability. And we've seen dramatic change in politics in a lot of places because of this. So when we talk about the impacts of climate change, we're talking about security, energy security, economic security, food security, even physical security. And the question now is pregnantly, what will the world do about it? 3 years ago, scientists warned that if we want to prevent the worst consequences of the climate crisis, we have to limit the planet's warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's the magic number by consensus among most scientists. The same group of scientists told us that we had 3 years ago about 12 years. So now, 3 years later, 3 years wasted, sadly, largely because of our president in the United States, around 2030 is the date at which we have to get the world now on the right path in order to cap the warming at that level of 1.5. So we are absolutely, clearly, without question, now inside the decisive decade. It is simply not acceptable, Wolfgang, for countries to think they can go to Glasgow, the meeting we will have, the COP, in November, and simply put big numbers out for projections 30 and 40 years from now or longer. It's what people will do in the next 10 years that matter. That's what we have to talk about. What are we going to do starting now, going to 2030, for the simple reason that if we do not sufficiently reduce our emissions, and that is true for the United States, as it is true for other major emitting countries like China and India and Russia and Japan and so forth, and the EU as a whole, if we don't reduce it, then we simply have not any longer got the possibility of holding the temperature at 1.5 degrees or of having net zero by 2050. And unfortunately, today, the day the United States formally re-enters the Paris Agreement, today, the fact is that only one or two countries are actually meeting what they said they do for Paris. And even if we did everything we said we'd do in Paris, the Earth's temperature will rise to about 3.7 degrees. So we have to raise ambition. That is why President Biden moved to rejoin the Paris Agreement hours after he was sworn in on day one. It is a process that takes 30 days. That means that as of today, we are officially back in again. But in rejoining, we got to be really honest with each other. We have to be humble, and most of all, we have to be ambitious. We have to be honest that as a global community, we're not close to where we need to be. We have to be humble because we know the United States was inexcusably absent for 4 years. And most of all, we have to be ambitious, all of us, because we have to get the job done. In November, when we convene in Glasgow for the UN Climate Conference, COP26, I believe it is our last best hope to get all of our nations on the right road to keep us at the 1.5 and achieve a net zero by 2050. We all need to develop not just a number, but a roadmap for how we will actually make the dramatic progress we need to make over the next 10 years, and what we will specifically do to get to net zero by no later than 2050. And we need to be working hand to hand with the private and public sector to provide the finance, which will be critical, finance in the trillions, in order so that countries can do what they have to do. We're already hard at work on this. We will spend the coming weeks and months working very closely with our European allies at the Leader Summit that President Biden will host in April, at the gatherings like the G7, the G20, at Kamilar, at our Oceans Conference, and in the Arctic Council, anywhere and everywhere we can, leading into the United Nations meeting in New York in September, and then Glasgow. Wolfgang, there's simply no faking it at this moment. Failure is really not an option if we expect to pass the Earth on in the shape that it needs to be to future generations. And so we all need to determine what success looks like, how to achieve it, and commit ourselves to get this job, above all, to get this job done. Thank you, and I'm happy to take a couple of questions.
Thank you, Secretary Kerry.
I would like now to invite one of our Munich young leaders, Ottilia Mogdanidze from Zimbabwe, to comment.
For the Global South and Africa in particular, climate change and the impact it has is quite dire. It has an impact on human security, on development, on stability, and food security. And that means responses both at local, national, regional, as well as international level have to be crafted to respond to the particular needs. Whether it's the drying up or the high temperatures in the Lake Chad Basin and the Sahel, or the locusts and the rains in East Africa, or the increasing cyclones and flooding in Southern Africa, these are key challenges that Africa faces, but that are also confronted by other regions in the world. Working together through a multilateral system that seeks to respond to these key challenges is important. To do this, beyond the Paris Climate Accord and beyond future-proofing the world, we need to respond to the now, and we need to do it urgently.
Thank you, Ms. Mogdanidze. Secretary Kerry, now we have a question from our Munich young leader, Claudia Gammon from Austria.
The US administration's climate plans closely resemble those of the European Union's Green Deal. A transatlantic partnership for climate security would therefore only feel natural. The European Union uses a trading system for carbon emissions, and we're considering additional measures to stop carbon leakage. But what steps could the US and the EU set together to try and build the biggest climate-neutral trading area?
Thank you, Claudia. Secretary?
Excuse me. Well, Claudia, yes. Claudia, thank you very much for the question. The answer is that we tried to do a trading system in the United States a number of years ago, but we had political challenges in getting it done. We do have a trading system in California, Washington, Oregon, and Canada. We have one on the East Coast called RGGI in the Northeast, and I think that this will increasingly become a key issue between all of us, because many people believe that the biggest return we get on our efforts could come from pricing carbon one way or the other. Obviously, creating a market is a way to price it. So I believe this is going to be very much part of our discussions. We need to come together. Europe and the United States could help by harmonizing some of the regulations and also the finance regulations. I know many companies are beginning to become much more tuned into their stakeholder rather than just shareholder responsibilities. And I think there's going to be increasing focus on disclosure by companies with respect to their preparation for the impacts of climate and the way in which that relates to the investing world. And this disclosure is going to become, I think, a very critical driver of good investment moving into alternative, renewable, sustainable energy, different new kinds of energy, whether it's hydrogen, different initiatives like battery storage or fusion or fission. I mean, there's so many different possibilities. What Europe and the United States could do together, I think, is help focus much of that energy, many of those efforts, and help to create a harmonizing of the definitions and the rules and regulations that will help govern the allocation of capital going forward.
We have a second question for you, Secretary, from Shafat Munir from Bangladesh.
Special Envoy John Kerry, thank you for your remarks. This is a question on Bangladesh. Bangladesh is going to be a major victim of sea level rise. The sea level rise projected by the IPCC could potentially result in the displacement of 25 to 30 million people. This will be a major destabilizing factor not only for our country but for the wider region, with significant security implications. Is the international community taking note of this and preparing for this eventuality? Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Shafat. Secretary Kerry?
Well, I can't speak for everybody in the international community, but I will tell you that we've been on the job now for a matter of 2 weeks, 3 weeks, I guess, something like that. And among my earliest calls was my call with the finance minister and then the foreign minister of Bangladesh. And we are inviting a number of countries like Bangladesh and others that wouldn't normally come to a major developed country summit, but we want these stakeholder nations to be present so that everybody will take account in the way that you have asked. And so in April 22nd, we will have we can't have everybody. We're not going to run a mini Glasgow, but we are going to have a sufficient number of representative regional participants so that the major emitting countries, the 17 major economies of the world and several other big emitting countries, will take note, as you've said, of the plight of people who are the victims of what has been building now ever since the Industrial Revolution. And I think it's going to be an important conversation. The island Pacific states, for instance, will be represented. I know my friend, the president of Palau, Tommy Ramengensau, has been a powerful advocate for facing up to the reality of what will happen to many of these states. And what was possible 20 years ago to talk about adaptation or mitigation now is sort of reduced to a question of where are those folks going to go live, and how do you replace that? So we have big choices in front of us. That's what the Glasgow summit will be focused on, and I don't want to wind up like we did in Paris, where many of those voices that aren't naturally or automatically at that table to begin with were absent for too long. And so there became a real rush to figure out how do you adequately get inclusive and bring their thoughts to the table. We're going to begin at the beginning, at least from our point of view, and I think everybody's going to listen very, very carefully, because the reality of places in the world that were 130 degrees Fahrenheit, I think Jens mentioned 50 degrees centigrade, you can't live and work in conditions like that, and that will drive major migration as a consequence. So we're all going to have to think about this. It's not a Bangladesh problem. It's not a South Asia problem. It's a global challenge, and we all bear responsibility for trying to help resolve it.
John, thank you so much. I wish we had a little more time. I was hoping to have time to ask you, among other things, a question about this conflict-ridden issue of Nord Stream 2 and transatlantic energy issues. But I think what I need to do is just send you the question over, and we'll continue this discussion in a different format. We now need to thank you. We wish you much success. We need transatlantic success in this matter. Thank you so much, John. Over to you, Natalie, for our last segment.
We are approaching the end of today's event, Wolfgang. Parallel to today's Munich Security Conference, another gathering of important leaders has also been taking place. We just said it, the G7 leaders meeting. And we are delighted to have its official host as our next speaker.
In 2017, Boris Johnson attended the Munich Security Conference for the first time. Then he was the foreign minister. A few months earlier, the majority of the population had voted to leave.
We're not leaving Europe. We will remain supportive of our friends and partners in the EU.
Johnson criticized the hesitancy of Western states in Ukraine and Syria. Red lines were being crossed, he said, and Europe and the United States must not ignore that.
We failed to deal with the Syrian crisis in the way that we might have done. We stepped back.
Today he's the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and advocates more firmness on the part of NATO partners.
Prime Minister, welcome. We're so delighted that we were able to figure out a way to include you in this program on this very busy day of yours, having just concluded the G7 leaders meeting. So welcome to the British Prime Minister. We are eager to hear about your personal vision for the transatlantic community going forward. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Well, great to see you, Wolfgang, Ambassador Ischinger, and Natalie there, and great to join you all, even if remotely. There's a habit of turning up at occasions such as this and announcing portentously that the West is locked in terminal decline and the Atlantic Alliance is fractured and NATO is in peril and everything we hold dear risks being cast into oblivion. And that industry of pessimism has thrived, I'm afraid, recently, perhaps even in Munich. So, without wishing for a moment to downplay the challenges and the dangers that we face in the teeth of a global pandemic, let me respectfully suggest that the gloom has been overdone, and we're turning a corner, and the countries we call the West are drawing together and combining their formidable strengths and expertise once again, immensely to everybody's benefit. As you've seen and heard earlier, America is unreservedly back as the leader of the free world, and that is a fantastic thing. And it's vital for our American friends to know that their allies on this side of the Atlantic are willing and able to share the risks and the burdens of addressing the world's toughest problems. And that's exactly why Global Britain is there, and that's what Global Britain is striving to achieve. And I'm delighted to report that I did detect exactly that willingness among my fellow G7 leaders when I chaired a virtual meeting earlier today. The shared goals of the UK's presidency of the G7 are to help the world to build back better and build back greener after the pandemic and minimise the risk of a catastrophe like this happening again. We all have lessons to learn from an experience that none of us would want to repeat. At the last UN General Assembly, I proposed a 5-point plan to protect the world against future pandemics. And today, the G7 agreed to explore a treaty on pandemic preparedness, working through the World Health Organization, which would enshrine the actions that countries need to take to safeguard everyone against another COVID. I intend to bring together my fellow leaders, scientists, and international organizations for collective defense against the next pathogen, just as we unite against military threats. The heroic endeavors of the world's scientists produced safe and effective vaccines against COVID in barely 300 days. In future, we should aim to telescope that even more. By drawing together our resources, we should seek to develop vaccines against emerging diseases in 100 days. Even in the early weeks of the pandemic, I hope that we in the UK resisted the temptations of a sauve-qui-peut approach, and we tried to keep the flame of global cooperation alive. We helped to establish COVAX, the global alliance to bring COVID vaccines to developing countries, and today Britain ranks among COVAX's biggest donors, with the aim of supplying 1 billion doses to 92 nations. And we will also share the majority of any surplus from our domestic vaccination programme. When Oxford University and AstraZeneca began their momentous effort against COVID, their express aim was to design a vaccine that would be cheap to obtain and easy to store, so that it could be speedily administered by every country. Protecting ourselves also means tracking the virus's mutations, and nearly half of all the genome sequencing of possible COVID variants anywhere in the world has taken place in the UK. Now, we need to mobilise our shared experience to create an early warning system for the next pathogen, enabled by a worldwide network of pandemic surveillance centres. And the UK intends to work alongside the WHO and our friends to bring this about. If anything good can possibly come from this tragedy, we have at least been given the chance to build a global recovery on new and green foundations, so that humanity can prosper without imperiling the planet. And to that end, Britain, as you've just been hearing from John Kerry, will be hosting the COP26 in Glasgow in November. And I'm delighted that America, under President Biden's leadership, has rejoined the Paris Agreement. The UK's aim will be to help rally as many countries as possible behind the target of net zero by 2050. We were the first industrialized nation to adopt this goal, and we've made it legally binding and published our plan for a green industrial revolution to show how we will get there. So I hope that other countries will follow the UK's example. But we can only address global problems alongside our friends and extend Britain's influence around the world if the UK itself and our own citizens are safe, including from the terrorist threats that we all face. The starting point of our integrated review of foreign, defence and development policy, which will be published next month, is that the success of global Britain depends on the security of our homeland and the stability of the Euro-Atlantic area. If climate change and pandemics are silent and insidious threats, hostile states may seek to harm our people in more direct and obvious ways, as the Russian state did with reckless abandon in Salisbury 3 years ago, only to collide with the implacable, immovable rock of transatlantic solidarity, sanctions, and coordinated diplomatic expulsions. An outstanding act of collective security for which, once again, I thank our friends. If we are to assure our safety, our democracies need to strengthen their capabilities to meet the rigors of an ever more competitive world. And it's precisely for that reason that we can keep our people safe, by fulfilling our obligations to NATO and enhancing the UK's global influence. That's the reason I've decided to bolster our armed forces with the biggest increase in our defence budget since the Cold War. The UK's defence spending will rise by £24 billion over the next 4 years, comfortably exceeding the NATO pledge to invest 2% of GDP, and ensuring that we retain the biggest defence budget in Europe and the second largest in NATO after the United States. We will focus our investment on the new technologies that will revolutionise warfare, artificial intelligence, unmanned aircraft, directed energy weapons and many others, so that we stand alongside our allies to deter any adversary and preserve the peace. This year, the Royal Navy's new aircraft carrier, HMS Queen Elizabeth, will embark on her maiden deployment, sailing 20,000 nautical miles to the Indo-Pacific and back. On her flight deck will be a squadron of F-35 jets from the US Marine Corps. Among her escorts will be an American destroyer, showing how the British, American and European armed forces can operate hand in glove anywhere in the world. But investing in new capabilities is not an end in itself. The purpose of the military instrument is to strengthen diplomacy and therefore maximise the chances of a success. We do not wish to live in a world of unchecked rivalry or decoupling or obstacles to sensible cooperation and global economic growth. Nor are we concerned solely with trade. I hope the UK has shown by our actions that we will defend our values as well as our interests. For the first time in nearly 50 years, we now have the power to impose independent national sanctions, allowing the UK to act swiftly and robustly. Our first decision was to create a Magnitsky regime designed to punish human rights offenders. The UK then became the first European country to sanction senior figures in Belarus after the stolen election. We've now imposed sanctions on over 50 human rights violators, including from Russia, Myanmar and Zimbabwe. We have consistently spoken out against China's repression of the Uyghur people in Xinjiang province and will continue to do so. We've introduced new measures to ensure that the supply chains of UK companies are not tainted by the violations in Xinjiang. After China broke a treaty and imposed a repressive national security law on Hong Kong, the UK offered nearly 3 million of the territory's people a route to British citizenship. We acted quickly and willingly, with cross-party support at home, to keep faith with the people of Hong Kong. Now that we've left the EU, Parliament has a greater say over foreign policy, and this has only reinforced our national determination to be a force for good in the world. Britain is working alongside France, Germany and the United States in a transatlantic quad to address the most pressing security issues, including Iran. And I sense a new resolve among our European friends and allies to come together and act again with unity and determination. And we witnessed that spirit after the attempted murder of Alexei Navalny as he recovered in a hospital bed in Berlin. While NATO was being written off in some places, the supertanker of European defence spending was quietly beginning to turn. And while this delicate high seas manoeuvre is far from complete, and the vessel needs to alter course, frankly, a good deal more, the fact is that NATO defence spending, excluding the United States, has risen by $190 billion since the Wales summit in 2014. When our allies on the eastern flank sought reassurance about their security, NATO responded by deploying a multinational force in Poland and the Baltic states. And the UK was proud to make the biggest single contribution, leading the battle group in Estonia, showing that we mean it when we say that our commitment to European security is unconditional and immovable. I believe that Europe increasingly recognizes the necessity of joining our American friends to rediscover that far-sighted leadership and the spirit of adventure and transatlantic unity that made our two continents great in the first place. A new world is rising up around us. Patterns of trade and commerce are changing. The global center of gravity is moving eastwards. The technological revolution proceeds with blistering speed. But none of us should fear or resent these changes. Free societies are united by their faith in liberal democracy, the rule of law, and free markets, which surely comprise the great trinity of human progress. Free countries, many of them located far beyond the geographical West, by the way, possess a boundless and inherent ability to release the talents and enterprise of their people to master and adapt to change. It is no coincidence that of the 10 most innovative nations in the world, as ranked by the Global Innovation Index in 2020, all but one are liberal democracies. There is no reason why our countries should not be stronger and safer in 2030 or indeed 2050 than today, provided we share the burden, compete successfully, and seek out friends and partners wherever they may be found. So I've invited South Korea and Australia and India to attend the next G7 summit as guests alongside leading international organizations. So let's resist any temptation to bemoan the changes around us. Let's build a coalition for openness and innovation, reaching beyond established alliances and the confines of geography. Proud of our history, but free of any temptation to turn back the clock, and harnessing the genius of open societies to flourish in an era of renewed competition. Let's respectfully dispel the air of pessimism that has sometimes attended our conferences. America and Europe, side by side, have the ability to prove once again the innate advantages of free nations and to succeed in forging our own destiny. Thank you very much.
Prime Minister, thank you so much. What an impressive statement. Please remember that you have a standing invitation to speak at the next in-person Munich Security Conference, and I promise, if you do that, if you come, you will not be the last speaker then. So thank you again for joining us on this very busy day of yours, and this actually concludes our program today. It is my pleasure to say to all of you that I've been deeply impressed with the statements. I've been impressed with the intensity with which issues like climate change have been addressed by almost all of the speakers. This was our first stop, our first step on our way, on our road to a real Munich Security Conference, hopefully later this year. Next stops on this road will include high-level events for senior decision makers on key aspects of transatlantic partnership and international issues such as digital sovereignty, such as biosecurity, such as classic geostrategic issues. We actually plan, as I said when I said goodbye to President Biden, to organize one of these high-level meetings in Washington, D.C., in order to allow senior European decision makers to meet with the members of the new Biden administration, many of whom will have been confirmed by the Senate, hopefully by late spring or so this year. Before we leave, allow me to express my gratitude and that of my team to those who have made this event possible, especially and first and foremost to our host broadcaster, the Bayerische Rundfunk, and all those who work for this wonderful organization. Thanks also to my own team here in Munich and in Berlin, whose dedication and professionalism is truly exemplary. This was a piece of really hard work to put all this together, I can tell you. And of course, a really big thank you. If there wasn't the pandemic, I would say a big hug to our Master of Ceremonies, to Nathalie Amiri. Danke, Nathalie. Thank you so much. Over to you.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me. This brings us to the end of the special edition of the Munich Security Conference 2021. Reminding us of Ambassador Ischinger's words of a world in danger, let us hope that some of the ideas shared today will help to make the world a less dangerous place, protecting the earth itself, its inhabitants, and the natural resources it provides us. We also hope that we will be able to return to the stage at Bayerischer Hof, filled with high-ranking officials and experts on global matters, for an in-person Munich Security Conference, perhaps still in 2021. Thank you very much.
This show has been produced by Depictions Media. Please contact us at depictions.media for more information.